This is it! The ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
That night began strangely between the hours when dreams faintly brush reality. The clouds were low, heavy with the color of unspoken stories. Somewhere in the quiet neighborhood, a lone porch lamp flickered like a sleepy heartbeat. And in the back garden of an ordinary house, a boy named Morty found something that had remembered him long before he would ever remember it. Before we begin, just take a breath. You are loved here, whoever and wherever you are. Tell me, softly, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Keep that moment in your palm like a small, kind light. Now relax your shoulders. Let the air loosen in your lungs. Grab your coffee, hold it gently. Let's begin. The ground was cool against Morty's knees as he dug through the loose soil at the corner of the yard. The day had been quiet, full of unseen weight. Summer just starting to lean toward autumn. He wasn't looking for anything. Digging helped him think. But his hand, brushing away grains of dirt, struck something smooth. It was a shard half buried, catching porch light. Not glass, not stone, but a transparency too deliberate to belong to earth. He pried it loose. It was no larger than a cookie, edges rounded like time had sanded its pride down. Inside the crystal, faint pale currents looped blue over silver, as if the shard contained weather of its own. He turned it over. Behind him the night crickets paused. A soft resonance, almost a hum, rose in the air, not through his ears but through the stillness. The sound carried words he didn't know he knew. Fall asleep earlier tomorrow. You'll need rest. Call her by her name, she will smile. Step left when the bus door sticks. Small things, soft prophecies, each overlapping like voices written in transparent ink. None of them frightened him. They were too ordinary, too kind to be monsters. They simply were, the way skies naturally hold light. He stayed crouched, listening. The longer he held the crystal, the more those whispers braided into rhythm, half lullaby, half reminder that time could be courteous if you listened politely enough. His heart slowed to match it. When his grandpa Rick's window light blinked on, Morty remembered himself and hurried inside. Rick was the sort of man who could press a button and cause the moon to blink. Yet that night he looked simply human, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "You've been digging again?" he asked without weight in the question. Morty nodded and held up his find. The fragment illuminated both their faces. For the first time all day, Rick's mouth softened into surprise instead of smirk. "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" Morty blinked. "Hearing what, Grandpa?" Rick gestured for the shard. "Hand it over before the neighbor's porch lamps start predicting the weather." But when Rick took it, he didn't laugh. He held it the way people hold feathers rescued from storms, careful, reverent. The glow climbed his fingers like memory-testing reunion. Whatever physics existed inside that shard, they spoke a language older than science. This, Rick whispered, half to himself, is resonance. Future vibrating backward. Then his face changed again into something Morty would later call gentle curiosity, that rare version of Rick, unarmed by sarcasm. "You found it because your heart was quiet enough," he said. That sentence stayed with the boy longer than the sound of the voices. Rick placed the shard in a small dish on his desk. Instruments flickered awake, screens washing the walls in blue light. Through them, Morty saw his reflection multiplied. Hundreds of translucent echo Mortys, watching one another from different angles of probability. They moved their lips at slightly different times, each speaking futures only fractions apart. He couldn't hear them yet. Only the original crystal whispered audibly, snatches of advice floating tenderly through the noise. Rick adjusted dials but didn't chase intensity. He watched the patterns as a pianist watches water ripple over keys. "It breathes with attention," he murmured. "The more you stare, the more it notices being seen." Morty leaned closer, curiosity mellowed by that same gentle awe. The shard pulsed once, almost affectionately, as though pleased to be adored without demand. Then, as simply as a sigh, it dimmed. Rick turned off his machines. "Enough," he said quietly. "Let it rest. When something promises too loudly, it's only because we've stopped listening to subtlety." They sat in silence. The old clock in the hallway ticked with patient insistence. Morty asked, "Do you think it's magic?" Rick poured 2 cups of something that smelled like vanilla and ozone. "Everything's magic until we name it. Let's not name it yet." Later, alone in his room, Morty lay staring at the ceiling. The shard rested on the bedside table inside a glass of water, Rick's suggestion to keep its nerves hydrated. Through the water, the light fractured into concentric circles across the wall, trembling like faint northern lights. The color moved with his breathing. Inhale, glow brighter. Exhale, fade. He felt a small companionship in that synchronization, as if the universe had chosen to keep him company tonight while pretending to be a crystal. He listened for the voices again. They came, distant but kind. You'll grow taller when you finally stop trying. Someday you'll learn that answers prefer whispers. Their sound lulled him towards sleep. Memories of the afternoon blurred. His hands dirty from digging, the lamplight trembling through window panes, his grandfather's rare gentleness. Everything folded together like pages closing. Before slipping fully under, Morty turned toward the window. The yard outside glimmered faintly where he'd found the shard. It looked the same as always, yet slightly rearranged. As though Earth itself had exhaled, he whispered to the darkness, "Thank you for talking to me," and the darkness, delighted to be noticed, stirred the curtains in agreement. The room fell still. Light dimmed. The crystal pulsed one last quiet beat. Somewhere between sound and silence, belief and proof, the boy drifted into a dream timed exactly to the pace of his own calm heart. And outside, both the world and the future waited politely. Breath held, until he was ready to listen again. Morning unraveled like silk sliding off a table, quiet, steady, nothing in a hurry. Rick was already awake. He was always awake long before morning had the courage to introduce itself. His coffee steamed on the desk, lab coat draped over the back of a cracked office chair, breath forming soft ghosts in the chilled air of the garage. Behind him, the crystal from last night pulsed inside a glass bowl half filled with distilled water. Every glow shimmered through the room, painting lazy constellations across metal tools and dusty walls. Morty trudged in, dressed for school, but still half inside sleep. His eyes were a little swollen from the previous night's wonder. "It's still doing that?" he asked, rubbing one eye. Rick didn't look up from his notes. Light remembers attention. We looked too long. Now it's showing off, the boy stepped closer. The shard had changed shape overnight, edges smoother, colors subtle as a cat stretching before nap. If he leaned close, he could see faint patterns crawling under its skin, tiny spirals turning toward his reflection. "It's like it's breathing. It's reciprocating," Rick said in that absent tone he reserved for the moments when curiosity outweighed cynicism. "Most things just echo when you speak to them. This one listens. Different, alive." Morty perched on a workbench beside him, kicking a dangling boot. "So what are you going to call it?" "Nothing yet," said Rick. He sipped his coffee and grimaced. "Name something too early and you box it in. Better to be a friend before you're an owner." That line stuck in Morty's head. Friend before owner. Rick's ways of thinking always came wrapped in sarcasm, but this one sounded tender by accident, like an unguarded truth slipping past his defenses. Rick tapped a sensor pad, and a faint hum rolled through the air. The bowl of water vibrated. The shimmer intensified until the garage looked underwater. "You hear that?" Rick asked. Morty tilted his head. At first there was only the hum, but beneath it a murmur began, whispering notes that felt more emotional than musical. Not words, not predictions this time, but sensations. Someone laughing far away, the warmth of a remembered hug, a pulse of distant rain. Memories that didn't belong to any single person, but to the act of living itself. Rick watched over the rim of his cup, eyes tired but gentle. It runs on notice. The more we feel when we look, the stronger it gets. Cure its battery. That sounds creepy. Everything intimate sounds creepy if you overthink it, Morty giggled, surprising both of them. The laughter did something remarkable. The shard brightened, glittering like glass touched by sunrise. Rick raised an eyebrow. "See? Empirical evidence, joy equals amplitude. So, happy people power crystals? Only the earnest kind. Manufactured smiles don't register on cosmic instruments." The garage settled into slow, harmonious work. Rick scribbled equations. Morty fetched tools he couldn't name. Outside, wind brushed the siding, carrying faint hums of city life. Inside, the two of them built small devices to listen. None of them clanged or sparked. Most looked more like wind chimes than machines. Thin wires, bits of old watches, the occasional bottle cap polished to mirror resonance. They hung the first instrument near the open window. When a breeze passed through, a low chord thrummed, perfectly matching the crystal's internal light. "That," Rick said, "is data singing back." Morty grinned, eyes wide. "It sounds like it's humming a lullaby." "Maybe it's telling you to go back to bed," Rick chuckled. "But yeah, lullabies are just equations written kindly." As day thickened into gold, the garage began to glow like an aquarium of patient science. Every surface held a swaying reflection of the crystal. At some point, Morty began doodling in a notebook, little sketches of sound waves, curls, and sleeping cats. Rick noticed but didn't interrupt. Observation was his version of affection. When they finally paused, Rick set down his wrench and sat beside the boy. "World runs on attention," he said quietly. "Everything you give your eyes to starts growing." Morty turned that over, the way you turn a small stone in your palm to feel every edge. "Even bad stuff?" "Especially bad stuff," Rick said, rubbing his forehead. "That's why people go mad explaining meaningless things. They water weeds with obsession. The trick is to notice without feeding." The words drifted easily into the air. The crystal pulsed twice as though agreeing. Morty stared at it. "So if I only pay attention to good things..." Rick smiled faintly. "You'll still get hurt, kid. But maybe you'll stay honest." For a long stretch they said nothing. Sunlight migrated across the floor, drawing slow stripes on the wall. Dust motes swam through them like tiny sleeping stars. When afternoon slouched into evening, Rick packed away the instruments. "Experiments like this don't need hurry," he said. "Let it gather itself." Morty yawned. "What do we call it now?" Rick tapped the bowl thoughtfully. "The Gatherer of Light," he murmured, half joke, half reverence. "Simpler than psycholuminescent temporal conduit." Morty smiled at the title. It sounded like the name of a friend he hadn't met yet. They carried the bowl inside the house and placed it on a windowsill between two potted plants. The crystal's glow diffused into leaves, turning them translucent jade. Rick switched off the living room light, and for a moment the entire house shimmered as if underwater again. "You ever think light gets tired?" Morty asked. Rick sniffed a laugh. "Of course it does. Why else would darkness keep it company?" He fetched an old blanket from the couch and threw it over Morty's shoulders. The edge smelled faintly of machinery and peppermint. They both stood in front of the window, watching the glass breathe soft color. Street lights blinked to life outside, each one dimmer in comparison. "Tomorrow," Rick said, "we'll listen deeper. But tonight maybe we just let it exist." Morty leaned on the window frame. The crystal pulsed slowly, timing its glow to their combined breathing. Moment by moment, the walls stopped feeling solid. Everything softened into rhythm. Even Rick's voice came out a notch lower, comfortable as an old blanket. "Sometimes, kid, the universe doesn't want solutions. It just wants spectators willing to stay gentle." Morty felt a yawn stretch wide and satisfying. His eyelids grew heavy. Rick guided him toward the couch, muttering, "Gatherer of Light says you need a reset." Through half-dream, Morty saw the shimmer refracted in the window glass. The light bent, split, then merged, forming something that almost looked like a smile. Rick stood for a moment longer watching, scientist wrapped around guardian. The line of his mouth mellowed. For once, laughter hid inside silence. He whispered to the crystal, "Don't teach him too fast," then turned off the last lamp. The rhythmic glow continued, blue and silver breathing in the dark, illuminating traces of graphite doodles left on the bench, unwashed cups and two shapes of recent conversation lingering like scent. Outside, the night leaned close to the window, curious about their calm. Inside, both generations exhaled, one in dreams, one in quiet thought, while the Gatherer of Light kept faithful watch, humming those unspoken futures softer and softer until even gravity seemed ready to sleep. The first night's sleep after discovering the Gatherer of Light felt deeper than usual, as if Morty had slipped beneath the surface of ordinary rest and drifted into the slow current of someone else's dream. Outside, rain slid across the windows in even ribbons, a lullaby written by gravity. The town was hushed, except for that soft percussion of weather practicing patience, and somewhere between thunder and heartbeat, the crystal began to sing. It wasn't a loud song, no melody or rhythm, just a constant undertone, like the electricity that hums inside sleep. The vibration reached through walls, threaded itself into Morty's pillow, and gently tugged him away from waking. When his eyes opened, he was standing on a hill made entirely of pale glass. Above him drifted a sky thick with static, clouds blinking like slow televisions between frequencies. Everything shimmered in shades of navy and violet. The air felt kind, like a blanket warmed by invisible hands. At first he thought he was alone. Then he saw movement farther down the slope. A figure was walking upward toward him, a boy about his own size but older in posture. His hair, same color as Morty's, glinted like the crystal's pulse. The stranger stopped a few feet away and smiled knowingly. "Hi," Morty said carefully. His voice sounded muffled as though spoken through water. "Hi," the other answered. "I'm what happens if we start paying too much attention." Morty frowned. "Too much attention to what?" "To everything." Before he could respond, the sky flickered again, revealing distant shapes, silhouettes of countless Mortys climbing different versions of the same hill. Each one shimmered between ages, some older, some smaller, all trailing faint bands of light like tails of comets. Morty watched them in quiet awe. They didn't look dangerous, only tired, as if they'd spent lifetimes remembering what they were supposed to forget. Each time lightning rippled through the static clouds, their faces shifted, echoing tiny alternate kindnesses and mistakes. The older postured Morty gestured toward them. "They're us. Every thought we abandoned midway." The crystal opened the door. Morty swallowed. "Rick said it listens." "It does," said his echo. "Sometimes it listens too well." The air trembled around them. Then, out of nowhere, another shape rose behind. The same face but shadowed, stern. A third version, eyes hard, arms crossed. "I'm the one who learned to win," that new voice said, calm but cold. "And winning is lonely." Something about the honesty hurt, the tone more confession than threat. Morty took a half-step back and asked quietly, "Do we all come from the same me?" His echoes exchanged glances. The one with softness in his eyes nodded. "Each of us is a future rehearsed too early. You're the first who's awake while dreaming. That makes you the listener." Behind them lightning flashed, no sound, only ripples of silver across rolling static. Morty watched entire landscapes briefly take shape in the glow. Houses, trees, people laughing, then dissolving back to nothing. He understood in that moment that the crystal didn't show futures in lines but in loops, each moment inhaling and exhaling the next. He knelt, touching the glassy soil, warm. Beneath his fingertips a pulse answered his own heartbeat, slow and mutual. When he whispered thank you, small ripples expanded outward, turning rain into glints of light. Suddenly the echo with colder eyes winced, collapsing to one knee. "Kindness burns," he said. "You're not supposed to hold it this long." Morty reached for him on instinct. The contact sent warmth through both. The dark expression melted, replaced by peace, the same serenity Rick sometimes wore when pretending to be indifferent. The echo started to fade, light scattering like ash without sorrow. The first echo, the gentler one, nodded approvingly. "Forgiving any of us helps all of us." And with that the sky brightened. Each silhouette paused, turned toward the real Morty, and offered faint smiles before transforming into wisps that drifted upward, merging with the static clouds until the whole sky glowed even. Steady. For a breathless moment he was the only thing left under the stars of someone's forgotten frequency. Then came Rick's voice, gentle yet coarse around the edges. "Kid, wake up. I need my couch back." The dream folded like lowered music. The hill tilted into darkness, and the sound of rain returned, anchoring him to warmth and blanket. He opened one eye. Rick stood at the foot of the couch holding two mugs. Steam curled lazily. "You were twitching," Rick said, handing him one cup. "Dream circuits whirling again?" Morty blinked, still halfway between worlds. "I saw myself. Lots of me." Rick dropped into the chair opposite. Everybody does eventually. Difference is most people refuse to wave back. The boy wrapped his hands around the cup. It smelled like cocoa and cinnamon, though with Rick nothing was ever just cocoa. One of them said, he hesitated, not sure if words would sound real, that forgiving helps. "Accurate," Rick murmured. "You watched empathy act as math. Should write that down. Forgiveness equals stability constant." His tone blended satire with respect. Morty didn't bother deciphering it. He was tired but peaceful. Rain tapped the roof again, slow and arrhythmic like applause filtered through sleep. Rick leaned back, closing his eyes now. "Static skies," he muttered, half to himself, half to the air. I dreamed of those when I was your age. Every scientist eventually meets his echoes. Did you forgive them too? Morty asked. Rick smiled without opening his eyes. Still working on it. They let the house settle around them. The ticking of the clock synced with the rain. Morty's reflection in the window looked calm, as if each previous version of him now rested somewhere safe, on the sill. The gatherer of light flicked in rhythm, steady pulses tracing invisible circles across the room. The glow landed across Rick's face, softening even the old half-healed lines there. For the first time since the shard had come into their lives, its presence didn't feel otherworldly at all. It felt domestic, belonging. "Grandpa," Morty said quietly, "do you think we can hear the futures because they're trying to remember us too?" Rick opened one eye, considering. Maybe memory's a two-way street. Maybe forgetting and predicting are just opposite directions of mercy. The boy didn't fully understand. That was okay. Understanding was never the goal in this house. Listening was. He leaned against the couch's armrest, eyelids drifting closed again. Through the half-light, he felt the universe shrink to a manageable whisper. No crowd of future selves, only the simple echo of his breathing meeting rain's gentle cadence. The crystal on the sill dimmed like an exhaling lamp. When sleep reclaimed him, it came tenderly. He dreamed again for a brief minute, not of the hill, not of variations of himself, but of Rick in the quiet garage filled with moonlight, of the way even tired love glowed when given space. Outside, static skies rolled quietly across the horizon of his imagination, though no longer threatening. They purred with the sound of connection, a harmonic lull that promised, every version of you is learning to rest, and somewhere in that sound, Rick's half-smile lingered, both weary and proud. Keeping watch until morning arrived without rush, morning came like a whisper through curtains, sunlight gentle as thought. The rain was gone. The smell it left behind, wet soil, iron, quiet forgiveness, still clung to the air. Rick's garage glimmered with leftover puddles of light, where drops from the roof had fallen through beams overnight. The crystal sat in its bowl, darker now, as if tired after doing too much dreaming. Morty arrived barefoot, hair in mutiny, pajamas still wrinkled from restless sleep. He held the shard carefully between both hands, as one might cradle something that contains another heartbeat. "It stopped glowing," he said. Rick glanced over his shoulder from his stool, welding goggles pushed high onto his head. "Yeah, everything sleeps after pretending to be immortal," he muttered, then set his torch down. "We overfed it." Morty placed the crystal back into the bowl of cool water. Faint bubbles floated from its edges like sighs. "Do you think it's mad at us?" Rick laughed softly. Less mockery than tenderness filtered through sarcasm. "Kid, light doesn't do anger. It does exhaustion. Same as people who care too much." The boy perched beside him on a stool. The dream was weird again, he confessed. But not scary this time, just busy. Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he wiped grease from his hands and looked at the window. Outside, the day vibrated with ordinary life. A bird unraveling a worm, a mail truck humming past, someone watering a garden an unnecessary amount. "Busy isn't bad," he said. "Means your mind's trying to sort signals from the noise." "What kind of signals?" He leaned back, voice slowing to match the steady rhythm of sunlight. "Compassion, regret, fear, human frequencies. They overlap until you mistake the feedback for music. The trick is, you gotta lower the volume to hear what's actually worth knowing." Morty frowned. "So like, stop paying attention?" "Not stop, soften." That single word hovered in the room like dust caught in light. Rick reached for an old pair of binoculars on the shelf. Their lenses were smeared with fingerprints. He wiped one clean on his coat and handed them over. "Look through those at the yard." Morty obeyed, squinting. The world outside shrank and sharpened. Leaves, clouds, the neighbor's red kite caught on the fence. "Yeah? Now breathe out on the lens," he did. The view fogged instantly. "What do you see?" Morty giggled. "Nothing. It's blurry." "Exactly." Rick took the binoculars back. "Sometimes that's the kinder way to look. Detail is good for machines, but life needs blur. Sharpness hurts if you never rest your focus." He pointed to the crystal. "Same rule. Soft eyes, soft seeing. Futility of expecting future clarity. We pay too much attention, it burns." Morty thought about that as a small silence bloomed between them. The only sound was the slow ticking of a clock that had arguably survived 5 different apocalypses. Then Rick slid from his stool and motioned toward the door. "Come on, fieldwork." Outside, the air was clear enough to taste. Sunlight spread across the world like warm water poured from a height, each patch of road steaming faintly. They walked past fences glistening with droplets and into a thin alley that opened to the street beyond the Smith's house. From a low branch ahead came the plaintive meow of a cat, entangled sideways in its own curiosity. Rick nodded toward it. "Case study, kid. Compassion in observable setting." Morty ran ahead. The cat was grey, small, trembling but defiant. Ferd hissed at his approach, claws half buried in bark. "Poor thing," he said softly. "It's stuck," and about to learn the value of calm, Rick folded his arms. "Go ahead, Professor Mercy." Morty climbed the fence carefully. The cat tried to retreat but couldn't. He whispered nonsense sounds, soft vowels, tiny promises. Eventually the shaking stopped, replaced by wary curiosity. Slowly he reached out, freed one paw then another. When the cat finally landed on the grass, it didn't run away. It pressed briefly against his leg, then vanished down the alley with typical feline dignity. Rick gave a half smile. "Congratulations, Dr. Doolittle. See what happened to the crystal?" Morty checked his pocket. The shard pulsed faintly again, a heartbeat restored. "Kindness cools it down," Rick said. "Data confirmed. That easy?" "Nothing easy about gentleness, Morty. That's why people avoid it." They walked home through quiet streets. For once, conversation refused hurry. When they reached the garage again, Rick filled 2 mugs with warm milk instead of coffee. Morty raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" "Caffeine accelerates thought. Thought accelerates anxiety. Tonight we decelerate." He clinked mugs with him softly. They sat on the bench facing the window where evening glowed like diluted honey. Rick placed the crystal between them on a folded towel, so it caught the last smear of daylight. In its center, faint colors moved, not restless like before, but steady, breathing alongside their own exhalations. Morty frowned thoughtfully. "Why does it even need us?" "Light doesn't usually care." Rick swirled his cup, watching tiny whirlpools form. "Because light's honest. It adapts to whatever looks at it. You stare at it with fear, you get distortion. You stare at it with hunger, it scorches. But stare with softness." He gestured to the crystal's calm gleam. "And it mirrors patience back." Morty leaned closer, resting elbows on knees. "So the future's basically scared of being judged." "Exactly. That's why it hides behind randomness." They laughed quietly together, the sound of shared looseness sliding through the garage. Night descended slow, wrapping everything in blue hush. Satin darkness crept along shelves and drawers. Outside, a wind chime caught the breeze, the same one they'd built in the last experiment, its pings low and sleepy. Rick yawned into his sleeve. "Lesson 4 complete," he mumbled. "Graduation ceremony optional." Morty tilted his head. "What's the next lesson?" Rick looked at him over the rim of his cup. "Learn to leave questions unanswered. Curiosity eventually becomes love if you give it enough room." A comfortable silence followed, the kind that doesn't need filling or finishing. In it, Morty noticed details he usually missed. How the lab's shadows made slow shapes on the floor. How Rick's breathing synchronized with the ticking clock. How the crystal's reflection on the glass looked like 2 tiny figures sitting side by side inside its core. He whispered, "Grandpa." "Thanks. For today." "Try not to make it a habit," Rick muttered. Then softer, "You're welcome." Soon after, Rick wandered off toward his upstairs chair, leaving Morty alone with the last minutes of twilight. The boy stayed. He liked the way evening folded around things, without asking them to prove their worth. Through the window, the yard shimmered faintly, the crystal's earlier energy spilling across blades of grass like secret phosphorescence. He watched the light fade until only memory held its color. For the first time, he didn't chase the moment to keep it. He simply let it pass, feeling how unheld beauty leaves a gentler mark. When he finally climbed the stairs to bed, Rick was already half asleep in the chair, book sliding from his hand. Morty covered him with a spare blanket. The gesture was small but enough to make the air warmer. Up in his room, the boy placed the crystal on the windowsill. The moonlight touched it once, approving, before hiding behind clouds. Morty whispered what Rick had said earlier, soft seeing, testing how the words felt in his mouth. They melted instantly into softness within him. He lay back, eyes closing slowly. The mattress hummed with quiet life. Future and past blurred, no longer enemies, just neighbors separated by a paper-thin wall of rest. Downstairs, the chimes gave a final, faint ring like applause too polite to wake anyone. Then the house, the sky, and every impatient thought surrendered to equilibrium, and somewhere, curiosity itself turned over in its sleep, smiling because someone had finally learned to see gently. By the end of that gentle week, the world had begun to hold its breath a little whenever the crystal was near. Streetlights dimmed by instinct. Clocks slowed half a tick. Even neighborhood dogs barked more softly. Rick claimed it was because light behaves politely for those who listen. But Morty felt it was something larger. The universe acknowledging that quiet could be a kind of intelligence. That Friday, twilight slid in through the garage windows like watered-down violet. Rick sat surrounded by open notebooks, whose margins looked like constellations drawn in caffeine. The gatherer of light rested on the workbench, glowing faint turquoise, neither bright nor dim, just attentive. Morty pushed the door open and entered with a cushion under his arm. "Pillow patrol," he said sleepily. "You looked uncomfortable." Rick smirked. "If comfort were useful, I'd patent it." He accepted the pillow anyway, nesting it behind his back. "Any new dreams?" Morty shook his head. "None, it's quiet." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Quiet's a rare luxury." They worked in companionable silence until a knocking sound split the calm. It wasn't on the door. It came from everywhere at once, not loud, simply present. The lights dimmed slightly. Dust motes performed uncertain pirouettes in the air. Rick straightened, mug halfway to his mouth. "That," he murmured, "is new." The sound repeated, 3 measured taps, deliberate as heartbeat. The crystal brightened in reply, color flushing to silver white. Then came a voice neither near nor far, smooth like silk dragged across wood. "You've listened long enough. May I enter?" Before Morty could ask what entering even meant, the shape appeared at the edge of the room. A figure built from outline more than flesh, its body a slow constellation of dim stars. Where eyes should have been, 2 ovals of clear glass hovered, reflecting nothing. Rick set his cup down carefully. "Well, there's punctuality for you. To whom do I owe the pleasure?" "I am the traveler discarded," said the figure, voice low and perfectly even. "Once I traded my sight for the certainty of tomorrow." Morty felt his stomach tighten. "You traded your eyes?" "I gave them to the crystal," admitted the traveler. "It promised clarity. I have seen every ending since. I visit those who are about to repeat my mistake." Rick leaned on the bench, unimpressed but intrigued. "Welcome to intervention hour, then." The traveler turned its glass ovals toward him. "You treat all with sarcasm." "Habit." Morty took a step closer, despite Rick's small warning gesture. The traveler's shape vibrated faintly, like heat above asphalt. "Why show up now?" Morty asked. "We haven't done anything wrong." "You soon will," the figure said gently. "Knowledge without kindness fractures into prophecy. You are carrying the same curiosity that blinded me." Rick crossed his arms. So a celestial critique of methodology. But Morty felt more than he heard. The being's words seeped into bone rather than ear. Behind their sound came waves of feeling. Guilt, exhaustion, longing for rest never earned. It wasn't warning them out of pride, but out of weary compassion. Rick lowered his voice. "You said you traded your sight. Did you at least get understanding in return?" The traveler paused. "Understanding, yes, peace never. I watched futures so precisely that I forgot to love the one unfolding." Morty flinched at that. The phrase pierced something still fragile in him. He remembered the countless dream versions of himself, each different, each lonely. He whispered, "Was it beautiful?" "Too beautiful," said the traveler. "Everything perfect is unbearable." The room seemed to inhale. The crystal's light surged, then softened, fluttering between blue and white like 2 contradictory thoughts trying to agree. With measured grace, the figure extended a hand, not solid, yet casting shadow. In its palm lay a sliver resembling dark glass. "Take this," it said. "My last fragment of certainty. Break it when the hunger for answers outweighs tenderness. It will show you exactly where wonder ends." Rick eyed the gift skeptically. Love a good cursed object. Morty accepted it before Rick could stop him. The shard was cool, startlingly light, humming like an idea half remembered. "Thank you," he said. "You may curse me later," replied the traveler. The lesson slower than gratitude, and then it was simply gone. No flash, no explosion, just absence replacing itself with ordinary stillness. The smell of ozone hung in its wake. Rick exhaled first. Well, he muttered, that happened. Spectral public service announcement. Morty turned the sliver over in his palm. Tiny reflections darted across the metal tools around them, like small memories escaping containment. Do you think it's dangerous? Rick shrugged. Everything is. Choice decides flavor. They stored the shard in a specimen jar next to the gatherer of light. For hours its darkness reflected that other brightness, two opposites trading secrets through glass. Occasionally Rick caught Morty staring at the jar with unblinking fascination. You're thinking about it again, he said finally. I keep wondering what it's like, seeing everything all at once. Rick swirled his drink. You'd hate it. Knowing the end kills jokes midway. Still, Morty couldn't help imagining. The hum from both crystals grew faintly stronger, singing a duet of contrast. Light and shadow sharing scales. Outside, the street lamps flickered as though politely applauding. Later that night, Morty couldn't sleep. The memory of the eyeless traveler haunted his mind, not frightening but persistent. He left his bed quietly and padded down to the garage. The darkness there greeted him like an old friend. Faint machine lights blinked in steady rhythm. The jar on the counter gleamed faintly even without power source. He touched it with one fingertip. A vision slid over him. Effortless. Cities folded into themselves like paper cranes. Oceans hanging mid-wave. People pausing mid-smile, as if the entire universe held still waiting for forgiveness. Then within that stillness he saw the traveler again, walking eternities blind yet unregretful now. You still have eyes. Whispered the thought that might have been the traveler's voice. Close them more often. Morty opened his own, trembling but calm. The jar's glow subsided immediately, satisfied by acknowledgement. He set it back and whispered, I will. Rick's voice drifted from the shadows, sleepy, fond, pretending annoyance. Breaking curfew to philosophize, huh? Classic protagonist move. Morty smiled sheepishly. Couldn't sleep. Good. That means you're thinking instead of reacting. Rick approached, hair a constellation of disobedient strands, robe smelling faintly of pickles and ozone. He looked at the jars, then at Morty. You know what scares smart people, kid? Morty shook his head, gentleness. It's harder than invention. He turned off the desk lamp, leaving only faint luminescence from the gatherer and its dark sibling. Their blended glow painted his face with conflicting colors, silver peace, indigo fatigue. Whatever that traveler was, he did us a favor. Certainty is just loneliness that learned how to sit upright. Morty nodded slowly. So what do we do with the shard? Hide it where only patience can find it. Together they placed the specimen jar behind heavier boxes of forgotten experiments, then covered it with an old towel. The garage looked perfectly ordinary again. Rick stretched. Come on, night philosopher. Tomorrow the universe resumes its regularly scheduled nonsense. They climbed the stairs. When Morty glanced back one last time, a gentle flicker slipped through cloth and glass. Less a warning, more a heartbeat confirming it was still there. Waiting for misuse or mercy, he whispered to himself. Soft seeing, remember. Don't stare too hard. Back in bed, rain began again, smaller, more deliberate. Sleep came after long minutes, bringing no visions. Just warmth, the reward for restraint. Downstairs in its towel-covered corner, the shard and the crystal pulsed in alternating rhythm. Distant cousins in perpetual conversation, one speaking light, the other shadow, both humming the same quiet promise. And through that melody, somewhere just above comprehension, a traveler with no eyes walked contentedly into darkness that finally felt kind. By the time autumn charged the air with that pleasant edge between warmth and chill, the gatherer of light had found its rhythm again. It no longer flared unpredictably or demanded endless attention. It simply hummed whenever someone in the house drifted toward kindness. Sometimes its shimmer rose when Beth kissed the top of Morty's head. Sometimes it glowed faintly when Rick, half-consciously, refilled the dog's water bowl before anyone noticed it empty. The science of it became impossible to chart, and that suited Rick fine. He once said, predictability is the death of wonder, and for once Morty caught no hint of irony in his tone. One evening, wind whispered through half-open windows, carrying the slow, dry fragrance of leaves dissolving. The house wore silence like a comfortable sweater. Morty sat at the dining room table, homework spread before him, pencil making hesitant constellations on the margins. The crystal rested nearby in its dish of water, household member number 6 by now. Its glow drifted like breath caught between sleep and waking. He lowered his pencil. "You ever feel like it's watching us?" Rick looked up from across the table. He had 3 lenses strapped to his forehead and an expression halfway between focus and fatigue. "It doesn't watch. It remembers." Difference being memory has mercy. How can memory have mercy? Because it forgets selectively. Rick adjusted a knob on his portable spectrometer, one of the few designs in the multiverse shaped like an espresso maker. A faint hum joined the crystal's pulse. "Memory chooses what to keep so we don't drown in analysis." Morty sighed in thought. "So it forgives by omission," Rick grinned. "You're getting good at this poet-scientist hybrid thing." He lifted the crystal delicately with metal tongs and set it inside a new device, half observation chamber, half glass heart. The instrument filled with soft blue vapor. Morty peered in, resting his chin on knuckles. Within the haze, threads of light began to form, thin filaments trembling as if under wind that no one could feel. "What's happening?" Morty whispered. Rick squinted through his lenses. "That, my dear Watson, is empathy made visible. Remember the dreams attached to this thing. Turns out they're contagious." "Contagious?" "In the best way." Rick adjusted a dial and the filaments grew denser, weaving around each other. Gentle sparks bloomed where one thread brushed another. Each line corresponds to somebody nearby having a dream. They vibrate like guitar strings when emotion peaks. "Look, this thick one? Probably Summers. She's got strong opinions even asleep." Morty leaned closer, fascinated. Each glowing thread hummed at a different pitch. Some low like foghorns, others high as night insects. Together they formed harmony, not song exactly, but comfort shaped into sound. The hum entered Morty's bones. He saw brief images in the air. A child bending to tie another's shoe, an elderly man feeding stray pigeons, a doctor holding her patient's hand after long news. Notes translated into acts of quiet decency. Every shimmer became a memory that hadn't yet happened, but already mattered. He swallowed, nearly whispering, "They're people's futures." Rick nodded. Dreams traveling ahead of schedule. "The universe always runs rehearsal first. Can we keep them?" Rick gave him a sideways look. "What's the protocol on possessing kindness, genius?" Morty blushed. "Guess you're right." They watched as more filaments appeared, hundreds now, filling the chamber until it looked like a chrysalis of light. Each thread pulsed in slow unison, the color shifting from silver to soft amber. The garage brightened, tools gleaming as if refreshed by sincerity itself. Rick opened the top hatch, releasing a few strands into the air. They floated out quietly, spiraling like smoke that never feared gravity. Morty tracked one as it brushed his sleeve. It slid through fabric, leaving a momentary warmth over his heart. A second later, distant laughter from outside echoed faintly. A neighbor's argument stopped mid-sentence and turned into apology. Rick chuckled under his breath. "See, field test passed." Morty stared, wide-eyed. "You think it changed them?" "Not changed, reminded. People forget softness. It just nudged recall. For a while they simply breathed alongside that humming light. It filled the garage with the same charged calm one finds inside churches that have stopped preaching. Even the wind outside had joined the tempo, rattling leaves with careful rhythm. Eventually Rick fetched half a dozen clear jars from an old shelf. "We'll capture a sample, not to own, to study resonance. Contain curiosity, not compassion." They guided threads gently into each jar, twisting caps loosely so light could still breathe. Morty labeled them clumsily: street dream, laugh dream, unknown dream. The letters glowed faintly blue under the light. Rick patted his shoulder. "That's enough outing for one evening, kid. Any more and the house will start narrating our emotions." As they turned off machines, one last filament refused to stay contained. It floated close to Morty, hovering before his face like a question that trusted him to answer kindly. He reached out. It wrapped once around his finger, and then vanished inside his chest. A soft warmth spread through him, as if some unseen being had exhaled forgiveness directly into his pulse. Rick watched quietly. "That one chose you," he said. "What does that mean?" "Means you're the carrier now. Congratulations, you're basically an emotional antenna." Morty laughed nervously. "That sounds heavy." Rick smiled. You just have to live gently enough that it doesn't snap. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Morty couldn't resist sneaking back. The jars lined the bench, glowing faintly. He touched one. Its surface thrummed with soft vibration. Each contact released shivers through the air. Images overlapping again. Strangers helping each other cross streets. Children trading jokes. Lovers rebuilding patience after long silences. He realized with a quiet shock that what he was watching wasn't future or magic. It was the everyday heroism of people deciding to care. The difference was only visibility. He smiled until tears blurred things slightly. The light in the jars shifted, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. "Hey," he whispered to them, "don't work too hard. You've already done enough." Behind him, Rick murmured from the doorway. He had the uncanny knack of appearing precisely when sentiment threatened to spill. Talking to bottled empathy now? Careful, it talks back. Morty wiped his eyes. Feels like if I listen close I can hear hope. Rick rubbed sleep from one eye. It's addictive. Hope always comes in overdoses, but I'd rather you use that than despair. That stuff has worse side effects. Together they watched light fade gradually to a dimness fit for bed. Rick screwed the lids tighter, but not fully. Enough containment to keep curiosity alive without suffocating it. Before turning off the lamp, he said softly, "Remember this night. It's the blueprint for sanity. Observe wonder, then stop before owning it." Morty nodded. What happens to the threads now? They drift back into dreaming minds by morning. Tomorrow everyone wakes thinking they've rested well without knowing why. Morty looked one last time at the jars, 6 calm universes breathing quietly. He felt impossibly small and endlessly connected, like an atom waiting politely among stars. Rick patted his shoulder. "Bedtime, maestro." As the boy climbed the stairs, the crystal pulsed once on the bench, a tiny farewell blink. Rick remained, pouring himself assignment-strength chamomile tea. He studied the dimming glow and whispered, "Good work, universe. Keep stitching." Outside, dawn crept across rooftops, dragging its palette of pewter and lavender. Inside, tiny filaments drifted out through cracks under the door. Unseen strands departing to weave themselves gently through sleeping town hearts. In one house, an old couple turned toward each other at the same time. In another, a child dreaming of monsters saw them smile instead. And in Rick's quiet laboratory, 2 jars blinked simultaneously like twin hearts sinking in gratitude. Upstairs, Morty sighed mid-dream, a sound halfway between laughter and rest, while the air itself braided all those sleeping breaths together in invisible harmony. The threads dissolved, one by one, until only the faintest shimmer lingered on the horizon, proof that tomorrow, already forgiving, had learned to hum in tune. The following evening arrived softer than expected. A spill of pale gold surrendered to twilight, and twilight itself seemed content to linger over the Smith backyard before letting darkness finish the job. The world looked scrubbed clean by quiet. Even the wind had adopted a librarian's whisper. Rick had filled the last jar from their series, each sealed cylinder resting on the garage counter like fireflies patiently waiting their cue. Morty watched, chin propped on folded arms. 6 jars, 6 dreams of human decency, glowing with the steadiness of calm hearts. But the boy's mind itched with unfinishedness. "Grandpa," he said, "what happens to them now? We can't just keep them sitting there like trophies." Rick replaced a lid leisurely. "Relax, artisanal empathy ages well, but shouldn't kindness be shared?" Morty asked, fiddling with a stray bolt that rolled like a restless thought. Rick's mouth twitched at the corner, half reluctant pride, half habit. "You volunteering for delivery service?" "Because compassion isn't exactly safe to export." Morty glanced toward the open door where the yard waited, a rectangle of shadow framed by starlight. "Maybe we plant it," he said. "Like a seed," Rick chuckled. "Growing soft, kid." But later, after dinner dishes murmured in the sink and the house settled into its nightly size, he came down carrying a small shovel and the unmistakable jar of brightest glow. "Come on," he said without drama. "Let's commit horticultural heresy." Outside, the air held its breath for them. Crickets paused mid-phrase. Somewhere a neighbor's porch light buzzed, imitating a small confused moon. Rick picked a patch of soil near the fence, where honeysuckle tangled through chain links. "The ground's decent here," he murmured. "He has seen enough spilled coffee and late apologies to fertilize sincerity." Morty knelt beside him, jar held carefully in both hands. They unscrewed the lid together. A faint warm vapor escaped, scented faintly of rain that had dreamed of sugar. Within, threads of light shimmered, those same empathic filaments from the previous nights, now swirling lazily like ribbons at rest. Rick tilted the jar. The contents poured not as liquid, but as a slow fall of glowing dust. Wherever it touched soil, the ground gave a quiet sigh, a sound more felt than heard, like an ache eased. Morty asked, almost whisper, "What'll it do?" Rick shrugged. "If I'm lucky, nothing explainable." They finished burying the glow under a thin layer of earth. No ceremony, only gentle pressing of palms. The moon rose higher, patient witness. Then it happened. A dim pulse beneath their hands, followed by another, softer. The patch of ground brightened until it resembled a piece of night-learning humility. From that gentle blaze, a stem unfurled, transparent, silver-veined, leaves reflecting the face of whomever gazed at them. The flower opened in slow motion. Petals shaped like ripples of water caught light from within, shining the color of forgiveness. Their reflections painted Rick's jacket and Morty's face in trembling halos. Rick exhaled what sounded suspiciously like awe. "I stand corrected," he muttered. "Empathy's got a green thumb." Morty laughed quietly, part disbelief, part wonder. "It's beautiful." They sat in the grass, both too afraid to move lest the fragile miracle obey normal laws of endings. The flower breathed with them. Each expansion of petals matched to their inhalations, as if recognizing its gardeners. Rick, ever analytic even inside Marvel, took out a small recorder. For the log, spontaneous photonic flora, activated by emotional honesty. Morty nudged his elbow. "Can you just look for once?" Rick froze mid-sentence, lowered the device, and actually looked. For several seconds he forgot the cataloging impulse. The simplicity of shared marvel straightened his posture. They watched as slight vibrations rippled along the petals' edges. Windless music drifted from within, a hum built from the same tones as the jar's original light, but now fuller, older. Morty realized the flower wasn't just growing, it was remembering. Each pulse contained whispers of every dream they had ever captured. One petal flickered brightly, projecting faint shapes, tiny moving silhouettes. A woman hugging her son at an airport, a nurse falling asleep upright after a night shift, a lonely mailman pausing to feed birds at dawn. Then the images faded into shimmering pollen that drifted upward like sighs made visible. Morty's throat ached in the best possible way. "It's showing us what it collected." Rick nodded slowly. "Nature's highlight reel." Another shimmer passed through. The vibrations shifted, forming words neither spoken nor written, but understood all the same. "Forgive aloud to keep me blooming." Rick blinked. "Did it just assign us homework?" Morty smiled. "Wes, it needs water made out of apologies." Without overthinking, he whispered, "I'm sorry for breaking your screwdriver last year." The flower brightened slightly. Rick rolled his eyes but couldn't hide a grin. "Fine. I'm sorry for calling empathy." He waved vaguely. "Chemical gullibility, better." The glow flared, lacing the dark yard in veins of silver satisfaction. "Okay, it likes that," Morty said, laughing now. They continued trading small amends, silly, serious, long forgotten. Each confession coaxed more light. The fence behind them caught sparkles, dew glinting like applauding stars. By the time they exhausted every apology imaginable, the flower's hue had mellowed to a calm, steady blue, the shade of peace deep enough to rest inside. It no longer demanded confession, it radiated acceptance. Rick massaged his temples. "Well, commence phase 2 of my emotional hangover." Morty kept staring at the bloom. "Do you think it'll stay?" "Everything stays somewhere," Rick whispered. "We just forget the address." They sat a while longer, basking in its faint warmth. Rick, perhaps involuntarily, rested a hand on Morty's shoulder, a brief, grounding contact. The air didn't dare intrude. The single star overhead brightened, echoing the rhythm of their newly planted friend. When the chill hinted they should go inside, Morty hesitated at the doorway. "Shouldn't we guard it?" Rick shook his head. "If kindness needs guards, we've already failed." He shut off the outside light, leaving the miracle to moon and self-sufficiency. That night, neither slept easily. Yet their rest was far from restless. It was purposeful half-wakefulness, the mind checking on something tender. And somewhere between their separate beds, the smell of newly turned earth drifted through the house, mild and grateful. Toward dawn, a faint sound stirred Morty awake, a bell-like tint just outside his window. He peered through glass fogged by night air. The flower was shimmering again, releasing gentle motes that floated toward the sky. Each carried soft light, rising until they merged with the last stars fading from the horizon. He whispered, "Goodbye," though the answer came as feeling rather than word, not goodbye. Continuing. Downstairs, Rick had apparently risen too. He stood at the doorway with mug in hand, watching the same silent fireworks. When Morty joined him, he simply handed over the warm mug and said, "Congratulations. You've invented botanical redemption." Morty grinned sleepily. It invented itself. Rick tilted his head. "Most good things do. We just provide the excuse." Together they watched the final lights vanish into dawn's wash of pale blue. The yard looked ordinary again. A patch of dirt. Dew-glazed fence. Nothing mystical to untrained eyes. Yet a faint silver vein traced the ground where the flower's stem remained dormant, waiting for thirst made of words. Rick broke the soft silence with the faintest smile. "So, Dr. Morty, what's your conclusion?" The boy thought for a long moment. "That saying sorry is a kind of planting." Rick raised his cup in toast. "And forgiveness, the photosynthesis. I can live with that." As daylight grew stronger, the two of them returned indoors. The living room smelled of coffee and warm bread, faintly laced with whatever scent honesty leaves behind. Morty scribbled a note in his sketchbook, an outline of a silver flower with the caption, "Only blooms when hearts unclench." Rick glanced over his shoulder, pretending to critique but secretly pleased. "Nice. Scientific poetry, disgusting habit. Keep it." They shared breakfast mostly in silence, though every clink of spoon against bowl felt like punctuation for a paragraph finally complete. Outside, unseen roots deepened, whispering across soil, tying house earth and sky into one patient organism of forgiveness. And as sunlight kissed the still damp ground, the flower's buried glow responded once, so faint a pulse it could have been imagination, signaling that the garden and the lesson had both taken hold. For several days after the silver flower's first bloom, the garage carried a sweetness Rick insisted was botanical backwash. Morty secretly knew it was hope. Each time they walked past the window, the soil outside reflected faint moonlight even at midday, a subtle shimmer like a heartbeat beneath the yard. The miracle had gone silent, but its quiet was music. Life fenced itself with small ordinariness again. School bells ringing, traffic murmuring, Beth's laughter between surgeries, Jerry pursuing hobbies called confidence seminars. Yet through the simple noise, a gentler rhythm lay steady. The gatherer of light glowed differently now. Less lamp, more pulse. Rick had begun calling it or metronome for tenderness, with equal parts sarcasm and reverence. On a sleepy afternoon, Morty wandered down to find Rick staring at a chalkboard scribbled edge to edge with looping symbols. Cups of reheated coffee lined the table in a spectral gradient from yesterday to unsafe. In the center of the mess, the crystal sat connected to thin copper wires like veins drawn toward curiosity. Morty rubbed his eyes. "What are you building this time?" Rick shrugged, not looking up. "Not building, translating. That flower out there hums in frequencies. I'm trying to find the math that forgiveness writes when nobody's watching." He patted a small amplifier that looked suspiciously like a birdhouse. "When people feel guilt, kid, certain sound waves go off. I just want to see what they add up to." Morty smiled faintly. "You're equationing feelings." Rick chuckled. "I'm listening to them through algebra." He gestured toward the glass bowl that still held their shimmering friend. Electric current brushed the crystal, producing waves on an old oscilloscope. "See that movement? That's guilt entering repentance." The line curved downward into a valley, then rose, forming a slow spiral. Rick's voice softened. "And up there, that's what happens when guilt gets forgiven." Morty's brows knit. "It's so smooth." "Exactly," Rick said quietly. "Forgiveness is excellent engineering." He picked up a battered guitar from a corner, a relic from adventures that had gone nowhere, and strummed a lazy chord. The oscilloscope trembled more brightly. "It responds to sound, to intention," Rick murmured, fingers finding notes as careful as heartbeat. He experimented one minor chord, one major. With major, the spiral expanded. With minor, it folded inward. Morty felt warmth climb his cheeks. It's like it feels sadness. Rick nodded. The equation sings back what you give it. Music and math always wanted to date. They're just too shy. They spent the afternoon tuning, humming into microphones, making small loudnesses. Each frequency bent the equation differently, and in those shifting shapes, patterns began to repeat, loops that turned guilt into rhythm and rhythm into calm. Rick noted numbers in scrawled handwriting that Morty could barely read. Hours passed unnoticed. Eventually, Morty dozed at the bench while Rick still worked, muttering to himself, if empathy equals harmonic, then sorrow equals, until his pencil trailed off mid-sentence. Wind rattled a window and woke Morty. Outside, the sky had deepened into that blue that tastes like metal, the hour between known and forgotten. The crystal had dimmed. Rick, half asleep in his chair, still clutched a half-empty mug. On the oscilloscope, lines drifted lazily but began changing without stimulus, patterns arranging themselves like thought deciding to speak. Glow, pause, glow, pause. Morty leaned closer. The rhythm matched breathing but faster, as if the device were nervous. With cautious fingers, he turned the amplifier's dial a notch upward. Sound filled the garage, not a tone, but voices layered on one another, whispers without direction, each finishing the other's sentences. I was wrong. It's okay. I didn't know. Now you do. The overlapping words formed chords of language, harmonics of admission and mercy. Morty stared, enchanted. The forgiving in the math had found voice. He whispered, "Grandpa, wake up." Rick snorted awake, blinked, listened. For once he didn't reach for a switch. He let the sound continue, the room vibrating gently like a sleeping animal. "It's all the confessions we made to that flower," Rick said, finally hushed. "The equation remembers." Morty nodded, mesmerized. But as they listened, undertones darkened. One thread of sound turned distorted, sharp as static. The spiral on the screen wobbled. Rick frowned, adjusting knobs. Something's off. Morty pressed hands over ears. Faint headache blossomed behind his eyes. It wasn't pain so much as crowding, hundreds of internal voices shouting for place. He gasped. "It's too much." Rick quickly killed power. The hum stopped, leaving only both of their breathing. "You okay?" Rick asked. "Yeah," Morty managed. "That felt like every thought I ever almost said all at once." Rick sighed, touching his temples. "Guess empathy's not supposed to feed back like that. We listened too loud." The crystal's glow wavered, cooling to dull gray. Rick's instruments clicked off one by one. Even the air seemed tired. For a few heartbeats, neither moved. Then Morty laughed weakly. "Maybe we overdosed on understanding." Rick smirked, rubbing his eyes. "Happens to the best of philosophers." He leaned against the bench. Insanity's just empathy without volume control. Morty felt dizzy but also strangely light. The silence after the sound was oddly beautiful, as if the universe had exhaled through them. "You know," Rick said after a minute, "we should reframe this. It's not failure. It's data on how compassion hits resonance limit. Meaning. Moderation isn't mediocrity. It's mercy for the nerves." That sounded enough like wisdom that Morty smiled. Rick smiled too, though it hurt the corners of fatigue around his mouth. They stepped outside for air. The night met them mid-sentence, cold but generous. The silver flower by the fence shimmered faintly, aware of their presence. Rick handed Morty a flashlight, but he left it switched off. Moonlight was enough. In the half-glow, tiny motes danced around the plant, bioluminescent dust from newly formed buds. Every bud pulsed in perfect tempo, guilt breathed out, peace breathed in. Morty touched one. The petal vibrated under his fingertip, soft as heartbeat through cloth. He closed his eyes, felt entire equations inside his skull smoothing into silence. Rick's voice floated nearby, quieter than the leaf rustle. "See, the math didn't break us. It purified itself. It's writing the simpler version of the formula out there." The pattern of petals moved like gentle laughter. Morty whispered, "Maybe it's teaching itself the same lesson you taught me. Soft seeing." Rick considered that, smiled sideways. "Then maybe I'm not useless after all." They stayed until dew began moistening their cuffs. When they re-entered the garage, the machines were still cooling. On the chalkboard, overnight condensation had blurred half the equations. Only one line remained clear. The last Rick must have written before sleep. E to empathy, TOS, forgiveness. He stared at it for a long moment, then chuckled. Sentimental nonsense pretending to be physics. Keep it. Morty copied it into his notebook, the way one keeps a lullaby in writing. Later, inside his bedroom, Morty lay awake. Every time he blinked, the spiral from the screen replayed on the inside of his eyelids. The overlapping voices softened now, like rain finding its own rhythm after a storm. He understood the madness the traveler with no eyes had warned about. Not chaos, but the drowning calm of perceiving too much. And yet within it, he found strange comfort. To feel everything was not punishment, it was proof of belonging. He whispered to the dark, "I forgive you," though he didn't specify who. The words loosened in the air and rested somewhere unseen. The dream that caught him afterward felt weightless. A room full of speakers humming together but tuned perfectly low, each emitting one note of acceptance. In another corner of the house, Rick sat with one jar of light open beside him, pencil tapping on his palm. He listened to faint humming that might have been the universe finding key signature again. Then he murmured, "Lesson logged. Infinity behaves when you whisper to it." He closed the journal. By dawn, the garage smelled of chalk and calm ozone. On the workbench, the crystal rested peacefully beside a single coil of copper shaped accidentally into a spiral, mirror to the dream pattern. Rick noticed it, smiled as though the universe had graded him with a quiet A outside. The silver flower exhaled faint light toward the sky, spreading invisible pollen across the sleeping town, tiny grains that carried one new mathematical truth, that forgiveness, spoken softly, multiplies faster than despair ever learned to divide. And somewhere high above, equations became clouds for a few content hours before evaporating into pure, merciful dawn. The morning after the equation sang itself quiet, something in the air changed, subtle at first, like the pause between sentences when both speakers realize there's nothing urgent left to say. The house felt heavier but calmer. Every sound arrived half a second later than it should have: the drip of the kitchen faucet, the rustle of pages from Beth's magazine, even the creak that usually followed Rick's footsteps on the stairs. None of it was wrong, it was simply unanswered. Morty noticed it first when he glanced at the wall clock during breakfast. The second hand hovered stubbornly between 12 and 1, trembling as though undecided. He blinked. It didn't move. "Grandpa," he said slowly, "did you, pause time again?" Rick, halfway through buttering toast, didn't look up. "Nope." "Why?" The clock stuck. He frowned at his plate as if it had insulted him, then raised his eyes toward the hallway. On the counter, his portable chronometer displayed the same frozen gesture of hesitation. Not stopped, thinking. Rick set the knife down carefully. "Interesting." "What kind of interesting?" Morty asked, nerves simmering. "The maybe we should open the curtains slowly kind," Rick replied. They did. Sunshine poured in with deliberate leisure, flowing like syrup instead of light. Outside, a bird hung mid-flight, wings half unfolded. A sprinkler froze, scattering glass beads of water that caught the sun and refused to fall. Down the block, Mrs. Nettle's car idled soundlessly halfway out of her driveway. She herself was a statue of polite frustration. Morty's mouth opened. No sound followed. Rick looked at the still world, scrubbing a palm against the stubble on his jaw. "Well," he said at last, "seems time called in sick." Morty gaped. "You're not, worried. Worried is 70% adrenaline and 30% imagination." Rick stepped outside. "I'm too old for both." He nudged one of the hanging droplets above the grass. It resisted for a moment, then drifted an inch, leaving a thin silver filament behind before settling into stillness again. The motion broke nothing, it merely changed posture. "Ha," he muttered, worlds breathing slower. Not broken, just taking a nap. He sat down right there on the porch step. Morty followed once fear's static wore off. The air neither chilled nor warmed, it simply held them, thick with potential. Their own movements felt like ripples in viscous liquid, rather than violations. Slow, reverent, somehow dream-compatible. Rick looked across frozen lawns and whispered as if not to wake the sleeping universe. Every machine eventually overheats without rest. Even clocks. Even time. Morty rubbed his arms. So what do we do while it's sleeping? Rick scoffed softly. Same thing you do next to a napping friend. You keep quiet. They stayed there for hours, or for no measurable duration at all, maybe both. With each breath, the silence grew roomier yet kinder, like a vast cathedral built solely of patience. Even the usual hum inside Rick's head, the constant problem-solving static, began to thin until curiosity felt comfortable sitting still. After a while he said, "You ever notice how everything exhausting hides behind the illusion of progress?" Morty glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "Listen," Rick said. He pointed at nothing specific. "That's the sound of the world without achievement. Doesn't it feel healthier?" Morty listened. He heard absolutely nothing and yet everything, the micro hiss of their breathing, some distant unlabeled resonance circling them like a promise. He smiled faintly. "I kind of like it." Rick chuckled, the noise oddly sacred within that hush. "Congrats, you've just passed meditation 101. They've sat until their shadows, which shouldn't have been moving if time were truly asleep, gradually shifted positions like old friends adjusting in shared chairs. Morty realized he was hungry and immediately laughed at himself for assuming meals mattered in paused worlds. Rick raised an eyebrow. "What's funny?" "Just that stomachs keep schedules even when time quits showing up." Rick grinned. "Biology's unionized. It doesn't care about management strikes." He stood and stretched. Motion felt syrup slow but satisfying. "Come on," he said. "If cosmic chronology's on lunch break, we might as well have tea." Inside, the kettle obediently stayed mid-whistle until Rick tapped it. Then, like a cautious animal after thunder, the sound resumed. A long, low reassurance. Steam curled upward, performing ballet in heavier air. Morty prepared 2 mugs while Rick slipped a notebook from his pocket. He wrote in looping script. Observation 90 temporal pause correlated with collective saturation of equations. The rhythm exhausted itself. Hypothesis? Universe resting to learn deceleration from its practitioners. Morty peered over his shoulder. Practitioners meaning us. Rick nodded. It saw 2 idiots slow down long enough to hear forgiveness math. Now it wants in. They carried the mugs to the porch and watched light stand perfectly still along the horizon. No dusk, no dawn, endless braided gold. Steam from the cups rose but never faded. It became part of the air, thicker than weather. "I like this version of the world," Morty admitted. "No deadlines, no clocks judging." "Careful," Rick said with a smirk. "That's how monks are created." Morty sipped, eyes half closed. "Do you think everyone else is dreaming right now?" Rick considered. Probably. If time stopped. Dreams finally caught up with their owners. The thought comforted them both. They began picturing entire cities exhaling mid-sentence. Bakers' hands frozen above dough rising perfectly. Commuters' half-smile caught before boredom returned. Lovers paused at the exact midpoint of understanding. The whole planet stilled at its gentlest frame, like a photograph taken by mercy. Hours, or moments, into their vigil. Morty asked, "So what if it doesn't start again? Would we age?" Rick tilted his head. "Technically, no. Existentially, absolutely. Stillness grows you differently. Sideways instead of forward." He drew 2 parallel lines with his finger on the porch dust. "People think time's a road. It's actually fabric. When it stops stretching one way, it weaves another." Morty traced the drawing until both lines became a knot. "Then we're being woven." "Exactly," Rick said. "Being alive in suspended time means becoming part of the loom." They smiled at the odd beauty of it. Silence stretched on long enough for understanding to replace language. When Morty finally spoke, his voice felt gentler, as if lubricated by grace. "It's kind of like getting invited to nap with the universe." Rick laughed warmer than usual. "Best invitation I've had in decades." He leaned back until the porch wall supported the weight of his amusement. For once his face, that map of sleepless inventions, looked younger. Morty saw the resemblance between this resting man and the flashes of brightness in his earlier dreams. The versions of Rick who still believed softness could outthink chaos. Eventually, something changed again. Morty felt it first, a subtle tick under his ribs like a bird remembering flight. Then a single droplet detached from the frozen sprinkler outside and fell, cutting a tiny path through suspended air. It landed on grass that moved exactly one blade's width. The second hand on the nearest clock, inside above the kitchen door, jumped forward once. Rick exhaled in satisfaction. There you go. Nap's over. Within seconds, sound returned, the far buzz of a lawnmower resuming mid-roar, a burst of traffic, Mrs. Nettle swearing amiably at her stalled car engine. Wind threaded through the trees as if apologizing for delay. Yet even after rhythm re-emerged, its tempo remained slower. Kind tempo, human tempo. Morty looked around, blinking as motion filled the world again. Did you do that? Rick grinned lazily. Kid, I barely manage my coffee intake. Credit the cosmos. It taught itself pacing. They went inside. The clocks ticked normally now, but their sound came softer, each tock cushioned by memory of silence. Rick poured fresh tea, its aroma curling upward like freshly written time. Morty asked, so what was the lesson? Rick stared out the window where droplets fell properly again. That even the infinite needs water breaks, he said. Maybe everything collapses now, and then just to experience stillness on purpose. Morty nodded. I kinda liked the world better when it was awake, but didn't rush. Rick raised his mug in toast. Then keep living like it's half paused. That's the secret. Carry quiet as internal timepiece. They clinked cups quietly. The chime blended with regained tick-tock, producing a duet somewhere between machine and lullaby. When Morty yawned, Rick grinned. Good. Survived Chapter 9 of Cosmic Breathing. Go nap. Calibrate your personal clock. Morty went upstairs, each step muffled in the new slowness the universe had left behind. Lying in bed, he felt atoms vibrate not with haste but with hum, the rhythm of existence rehabilitated. Before sleep claimed him, he murmured, thanks, time, for waiting, and deep beneath the house, unnoticed, the gatherer of light pulsed once at the same gentle pace. A luminous acknowledgement that rest, too, could be a form of motion. Outside, night would eventually come, but half a heartbeat later than usual, just enough delay for the world to sigh contentedly and think, before continuing, how good it had felt to forget ticking for a while. The week after Time's little nap moved gently, as though every clock in the neighborhood still remembered how pleasant resting had been. People walked slower to their cars. Even traffic lights seemed less insistent. Something invisible had settled over everything, a rhythm too delicate to define but easy to feel. Inside the Smith house, the echoes of that stillness swirled like unseen perfume. Rick caught himself humming while soldering wires, a rare act of unintentional joy. Morty noticed that Beth smiled more softly when she thought nobody watched. The gatherer of light glowed faintly at these moments, like a cat purring in its sleep. Then, one quiet Wednesday after school, Morty decided to share it. He asked Rick if it was safe. Safe. Rick repeated, eyebrows half raised, voice more amused than concerned. Kid, kindness is volatile, but it only explodes into better versions of itself. So sure, export away. Morty pocketed a few of the smaller crystal shards produced during their experiments, each no bigger than a coin. Under sunlight they looked modest, almost mundane, barely sparkles in glass. But at evening's edge they pulsed gently, carrying warm hues of lavender and silver. He threaded thin cords around them, turning them into pendants, not jewelry so much as invitations. At dinner he placed one on the kitchen table beside his sister. What's this? Summer asked, holding it to the window light. The glow spilled up her wrist like friendly moonlight. A piece of something that remembers kindness. Morty answered, sort of a reminder. She grinned despite herself. Wow, hallmark Morty. But later that night, he saw her hanging it beside her mirror, where it cast a subtle shimmer when she smiled at her reflection. The next day at school, he gave another piece to a classmate who often sat alone at lunch. A quiet boy named Benny, who preferred drawing maps of imaginary constellations instead of talking. Benny took the shard with awe and a fumbling, thanks. During recess he held it to the sun, whispering names for stars that hadn't been discovered. The shard responded with a soft pulse, approving each invented galaxy. Word spread quietly. Morty never claimed the crystals were magic. He only described them as fragments of affection. The phrase felt right, less miracle, more memory. By Friday, 3 teachers had tiny slivers sitting on their desks, catching the window light like tame miracles imported from gentler worlds. At home, Rick observed the slow invasion of decency with one raised eyebrow and a faint, begrudged pride. "Congrats," he said, swirling his drink. "You've started a black market in Goodwill. What's next?" "Therapy franchises," Morty laughed. "They just make people smile. That's all." Rick tilted his head. "You noticing or measuring?" "Maybe both." "Good," Rick said softly. Observation is empathy's microscope. That weekend they took a walk into town, a habit they seldom practiced without purpose. Morty wanted to see how far the kindness reached. The air that day had scent of baking bread and faint cinnamon. Sunlight ran thin between clouds, like gold stretched across parchment. People moved differently. No deliberate change. Just the ease of forgotten arguments temporarily forgiven. Outside the cafe, they saw two strangers sharing the newspaper one page at a time. At a crosswalk, an impatient driver waved anxious pedestrians ahead with a grin he didn't seem to have rehearsed. Each act small but synchronized, pieces within some unseen orchestra. Rick leaned on his cane, a purely aesthetic choice since he didn't actually need one. He said, "See that? Butterfly effect with better PR." Morty smiled. "It works." Rick nodded once, but noticed something. The shards only amplified what was already possible. They didn't create goodness, they reminded it. "You sound almost proud," Morty teased. "Don't ruin my reputation." That night, Morty's room resembled a galaxy of trinkets. Bits of the Gatherer shimmered across his desk. He planned to send the remaining ones to people who might need them most. Beth's overworked hospital colleagues, the lonely mailman, even that sarcastic neighbor who watered plants at midnight. He packed each into small envelopes with handwritten notes. "For the moments you forget you matter." Rick entered halfway through, pretending irritation. "You running a cult of well-being?" Morty grinned. "You're the co-founder. It's too late to quit now." Rick chuckled and picked up one shard. Under the lamp, it caught spiral reflections of their faces. For an instant he saw himself younger, unscarred by exhaustion. "Funny," he murmured. "How something this small keeps handing out second chances." Morty sealed another envelope. "When you taught me about softness, did you know it spread like this?" "Kid, I didn't even know I could teach." Rick sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing at his hand. "You did the heavy lifting. I just stopped ruining good silence." A line settled between them, understanding quiet as breath before sleep. The air smelled faintly of glue and moonlight, mundane and miraculous, inseparable. The next evening, letters traveled out into the city, carried by a tired male clerk who unknowingly hummed an old lullaby while sorting packages. No one knew they contained fragments of a reformed universe folded to postage size. They would arrive quietly like kindness usually did, showing up without introduction. 2 days later, Morty dreamt that he hovered above the town at night. Below him, hundreds of tiny lights dotted windows, not from lamps or phones, but from crystals softly agreeing with one another. He heard humming again, the same hum from the old equation Rick had built, a chorus of discrete hearts recalibrated to the same forgiving rhythm. It was neither triumphant nor melancholy, it was exactly enough. When he told Rick about the dream over breakfast, the old man paused mid-sip. "Interconnected resonance," he said cautiously, "or poetry. Both respectable." Morty smiled. "They're probably the same thing." "Poetry's just science that's had enough coffee," Rick replied. "Still nice work." Then quieter. "I don't usually say this, but the kid who broke my screwdriver might be saving entire neighborhoods from grumpiness." Morty grinned. One block at a time. A few days later, one more visitor arrived, a small boy from Morty's school who clutched a makeshift necklace glowing faint blue. He shyly handed Morty a folded note. "It helped my mom sleep after weeks of crying." "Is there more?" Morty blinked. "It helped." The boy nodded, eyes watery but bright. "She said it reminded her how to breathe slow." Rick watched, pretending to focus on his screwdriver. When the boy left, he muttered, "I remember when my inventions caused explosions instead of naps." "Refreshing." Morty laughed softly. "Better footprint." Rick nodded. Smaller boom. Bigger echo. That night they decided to do something ceremonial but simple. They gathered the remaining fragments into a wooden bowl, placed it near the glowing jar from earlier experiments, and stood side by side. Rick raised a glass of something amber. Morty, a mug of cocoa. To what are we toasting? Morty asked. To contagious decency, Rick said. And to restraint, that rare talent of not improving what's already enough. They clinked, breath fogging the air as laughter replaced formality. Then, as if responsive to their mood, the bowl of shards ignited in silent luminescence. Each fragment hovered for a heartbeat, then dissolved into faint streaks, sliding toward the ceiling like tiny comets. They didn't burst, only drifted until absorbed into the plaster and vanished. Morty stared upward. Whispering, "They're gone," Rick grinned. They graduated. Next morning, light in the kitchen had new texture, softer, kinder. The world continued its errands, unaware of the quiet network humming beneath perception, people greeting each other with marginals of extra warmth. Small impatiences swallowed before forming words, a few strangers catching themselves mid-cynicism, surprised by sudden tenderness. Rick poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Morty. "Congratulations. Your benevolence went viral." Morty chuckled. "Can't wait till the media blames global niceness on mysterious teen." Rick sipped. "World's allergic to simplicity. They'll find a way." Then, softly, "You did good, kid. You reminded it how to hum." Outside, clouds drifted slow and content. On the far fence, the silver flower swayed, releasing another puff of luminous pollen that faded almost instantly but left an afterglow even in daylight. Morty reached for his cup, steady smile lingering. For the first time, the future felt less like something attacking from ahead and more like warmth approaching at a comfortable pace. Rick noticed, nodded once. "This," he said, waving lazily at the air, "is what progress looks like when it loses its anxiety." They drank in silence. The faint ticking of clocks, unhurried, perfectly normal, wove around them like percussion. Each sound of seconds was a soft thank you from the universe for being cared for and not dissected. And somewhere beyond all clocks and math, a gentle vibration swept across the evening's edge, the gatherer of light spreading new whispers, that every affection, once given, eventually returns as daylight softened by gratitude. Autumn deepened, the days ripening into that bittersweet hour when air smells faintly of distance. Leaves outside the Smith house burned through their last colors and began their slow rehearsal for falling. The flower at the fence stayed alive longer than any botany book would allow, its silver petals catching dusk like a patient memory. Every evening, Morty would lean on his windowsill, watching moonlight drape over it, convinced that some of its calm spilled across the town like perfume. Rick, meanwhile, had grown contemplative. The equations that once covered his chalkboard remained but felt unnecessary. He still tinkered. Of course, restless hands can't abandon motion, but somewhere behind the sarcasm a subtle calm had taken residence. He claimed he was experimenting with being unambitious for once. No one quite believed him, yet the invention that came next proved him partly right. One afternoon he called Morty into the garage. "I built something that doesn't fix anything," he announced. "That's progress." On the workbench sat a small box of aged walnut wood. Its top carried a single button carved from translucent shell, no lights, no wires. Just a quiet elegance that looked wholly out of place amid his mechanical chaos. Morty tilted his head. "What's it for?" Rick shrugged. "It listens instead of works. Microphones feed directly into the crystal's harmonic core, similar setup, but reversed. Instead of hearing voices, it receives music." "What kind of music?" "The unintentional kind," Rick said. "The sounds between songs, hums, sighs, the noises people make when language remembers to be gentle." He pressed the button. The box released a faint shimmer, not quite sound, more vibration threading around their spines. Out of that tremor, a voice began to form, female, ageless, tender enough to lower blood pressure by existing. "Sleep, even standing." The voice sang softly. "Rest the thoughts that measure you." Morty felt goosebumps trace his arms. "Who is that?" Rick's face lost its usual grin. "I don't know." She came through the frequencies. Could be residual code from the empathy math. Could be the universe humming her own bedtime story. They listened. The melody expanded into room corners. Dust motes twirled within its vibration, turning plain air into shimmer. Her tone carried no lyrics after that. only vowel sounds shaped like comfort. Morty closed his eyes. The music felt ancient, as if generations of calm had been compressed into a voice and stored for safekeeping. Rick looked almost embarrassed when the song ended. "Well, that's new. The Cosmos just joined my band," Morty whispered. "It was beautiful." Rick coughed into his sleeve, pretending to find a fly. "Yeah, well, beauty's overrated if you can't reproduce it. Let's see if she'll call back." He tinkered for hours, adjusting dials until the garage resembled a cave full of heartbeats. Whenever the apparatus aligned exactly, the woman's humming reappeared, responding to adjustments as if aware of being tuned. It became ritual. Each evening, they'd dim the lamps, sit beside the glowing crystal, and press the shell button. The sound would bloom again. No words, just melody weaving sleepy patience around their hearts. Sometimes the voice echoed faintly through the rest of the house. On those nights, Beth slept deeper, Jerry dreamed of simple successes, and even Summer's phone fell silent before she did. On the sixth night, the humming changed. Notes elongated into true words. Morty leaned forward until the world beyond sound ceased. "No need to run," the voice crooned. "The future waits when called by name." Rick scribbled half the line onto his wrist before realizing ink couldn't record melodies. Morty asked softly, "Should we answer?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "How do you talk back to a disembodied lullaby?" Nevertheless, he spoke into the machine. "Who are you?" The crystal pulsed once, releasing a cascade of harmonic ripples. Then came the reply, "One who remembers what you forgot to sing. Every mind that listens creates me. I exist in rest." Rick's cynicism failed him completely for a moment. Morty saw it, the flash of awe that lived behind disbelief. "So you're not, dangerous. Danger is only speed." I moved slow. The hum dimmed to silence. They went outside for air. The night hung thick with stars. The moon curved like a pocket of light poured lazily over rooftops. Rick leaned against the fence. She said, "Danger is speed. That's not terrible advice." Morty nodded. "Feels like she's alive inside the sound. More like a voice print of sanity." Rick answered. "Intelligence left over from every kindness ever hummed, but never recorded." He chuckled. "Cosmic B-sides." They both laughed quietly, breath turning to mist. The silver flower glowed faintly between them, reflecting starlight back into their faces. Its petals seemed to listen too. Days passed, blending music with everyday noise until the boundary between them blurred. Morty noticed that when he faced anxiety, a test, a disappointing afternoon, a sudden pang of loneliness, the melody surfaced in memory, not in detail but in texture. It softened his breath, lengthened pauses between thoughts. "Danger is speed." He whispered it like prayer. Rick, meanwhile, published nothing. He called it private research into collective rhythm. But the truth was simpler. Some discoveries were too serene to exploit. On certain late nights, Morty caught him sitting before the device, eyes closed, the song flowing over him like a tide. Then one evening, as storm clouds built themselves into towers, the voice returned without invitation. Lightning flowered in slow motion through thick sky. From the garage doorway, they saw the rain start not as drops but as threads, silver cords hanging from heaven. The machine activated by itself. The woman's hum joined the thunder. Perfect counterpoint. This time the sound extended outside. Neighbors' wind chimes caught the key. The silver flower in the yard opened, though it wasn't night yet. Everything that could produce tone joined. Pipes sang. Trees sighed. Even Rick's instruments emitted tiny notes of resonance. The entire street became orchestra. Morty's breath hitched. "What's happening?" Rick's eyes shone. "She's using the storm as speaker system." Then, above all other sounds, the voice said, soft but clear enough to carry across existence, "Kimness needs cadence. Let all who forget remember through song." For a fleeting minute, the whole town obeyed. Dogs quieted, infants stopped crying mid-sound as if mid-chorus. Then the electricity snapped back into ordinary volume. Rain fell normally. The garage returned to human scale. Rick removed his glasses and wiped moisture from them that might have been rain. "You realize we just witnessed the universe hum its own lullaby to humanity." Morty shrugged slowly, too overwhelmed for syntax. "It sounded like forgiving." Rick laughed softly. That's probably the first music review worth publishing. For days after the storm, a calm draped the city. Commuters smiled at detours. Machines at the hospital beeped in subtle rhythm like syncopated hearts. Morty walked down the hall hearing fragments, people humming pieces of a tune they didn't know they knew. The voice had seeded itself in collective memory, exactly as she promised every mind that listens creates me. Back home, Rick adjusted the machine one final time. He enclosed the crystal within the wooden shell, sealing it. No button, no wires, just still wood and a fingernail-sized emblem of silver on top. "You locking her away?" Morty asked. "Preserving silence," Rick said. "She'll turn up whenever quiet starts dying again." "Sound doesn't need permission." Morty nodded, gazing at the box one last time. "Think she'll sing again for us?" Rick glanced toward him, tone playful but wary. "She never stopped. You just have to slow down enough to notice." That night, Morty dreamt vividly. He sat at the edge of a dark lake, surface opaque but trembling with invisible current. Across from him floated the faint outline of a woman whose hair blended with stars. She sang wordless phrases, ripples raced out in circles, and wherever a ripple touched shore, tiny flowers opened, each identical to the silver one at their fence. When she paused, she smiled at him and whispered, "Keep what you've heard simple enough to hum." Morty woke before dawn. The world outside dripped quietly from the evening's leftover rain. He padded down to the kitchen where Rick already waited, nursing what passed for tea. On the table rested the sealed wooden box. Through its seams glowed the faintest pulse, keeping time with their breathing. "Couldn't sleep?" Rick asked. "Was dreaming?" Morty said. "She told me to keep the song simple." Rick smiled. A rare full one. Smart woman. They stood by the window watching the first rays soak the garden. The silver flower nodded gently in the morning breeze, petals glinting like instruments at rest. Between them, peace expanded, wordless but complete. The kind of silence that could start a melody again whenever the world forgot. Rick whispered as if to himself, "Danger is speed." Then, grinning at Morty, "So let's stay lazy a while." And beyond the fence, where dawn condensed against the dew, the unseen chorus of the cosmos sighed its approval, a soft hum spreading through both of them like inherited memory, until thoughts themselves dozed, readying for the next dream. Winter drifted in with minimal ceremony. The air outside the Smith house tasted of copper and chimney smoke. Roofs turned pale under polite dustings of snow that never quite committed to storm. Inside, warmth coiled through vents and conversations alike. The town was softer these days, as if that great lullaby had tuned everything to gentler frequencies, but Rick himself grew uncharacteristically silent. The humor stayed, shaggy and functional, yet when laughter came it bent inward, ending in sighs. Morty noticed the change. Rick spent more time alone in the garage late at night, lights dimmed to a lonely lunar glow. The boy would hear faint metallic clinks long after everyone else surrendered to sleep. It wasn't the sound of frantic invention. It was rhythmical, deliberate, like someone building penitence bolt by bolt. One evening Morty couldn't resist. He padded down in socks, cracking the door softly. The sight beyond felt like witnessing someone dream while still awake. Rick sat amid a ring of flickering candles, real ones, their wax dripping onto stained floorboards. In front of him stood a contraption no taller than his torso, parts scavenged from radio dials, watch pieces, an old music box heart. Thin conduits of light threaded between its components the way veins arrange themselves when they recognize a heart worth serving. Each candle corresponded to a small glass funnel inserted into brass tubing. Inside those funnels shimmered faint images, someone laughing, crying, leaving. Morty whispered, "What is that?" Rick didn't startle. His voice came low, almost reverent. "Nothing dangerous. Just a recycling project. Looks like light trapped in glass." Rick nodded once. "Regret, for lack of better variable. Every memory I've run from has mass. Figured I'd stop polluting and convert it." "Convert it into what?" He tapped one candle wick with a soldering iron. A small plume of luminescent vapor rose and curled toward the ceiling. "Energy," Rick said softly, "but not the kind you measure in joules. Think of it as warmth, which is basically guilt behaving nicely." Morty stepped closer, eyes wide at the delicate architecture of remorse arranged before him. He pointed at the first candle's flicker. Whose memory's that one? Rick followed the flame with his gaze. A faint reflection of adolescent him blinked within. First time I lied to impress a teacher, he said. She believed it. Confidence feels heavier when borrowed. Morty looked to the next candle, where light burned steadier, deeper. And that one? Someone I loved, briefly and badly. The universe collects more mistakes from affection than science ever will. A few more moments of watching passed in hush. The garage smelled of wax, ozone, and something intangible, like tears that had burned themselves honest. Rick adjusted a lever, and the machine began its gentle murmuring spin. Each candle's flame leaned inward, merging gradually, the air filled with a sound halfway between heartbeat and ticking. Slowly, the brass funnels emitted soft cylinders of light that pooled at the center before rising as thin columns toward the rafters. They didn't vanish, they hovered, tiny suns caught mid-repentance. Morty spoke almost to himself. It's beautiful. Rick gave a crooked smile that didn't quite survive its own sincerity. Sounds better than tragic. I'll take it. But why candles? The boy asked after a pause. Fire's the only thing dumb enough to turn grief into color every single time. For a while they said nothing. Rick's eyes moved over the glowing pillars as if counting blessings disguised as losses. Then Morty noticed a small unlit candle lingering at the machine's edge. What about that one? Rick hesitated. That one needs kindling I can't create myself. Morty waited. It's the regret I still carry for being afraid of gentleness. Rick admitted. Can't light that without help. Usually such confessions from him arrived disguised behind sarcasm. This one didn't bother with costume. It landed gently but heavy. Morty reached out, touching the dormant wick. Warmth leapt between his fingertip and flamed to be. A slow spark exhaled across wax until the 8th candle lit. Rick looked mildly stunned, like a man who'd heard his own heartbeat after years of interference. Kid, he murmured. Didn't think empathy could double as jumper cables. Morty smiled. Team effort, right? The newly awakened flame joined the circle, completing symmetry. The column it produced was different, paler, but steady as sunrise behind fog. They watched until every candle's energy equalized into golden hum. By then both had stopped speaking. When Rick did break the quiet, his voice barely rose above the candle's whispers. You know, there's a point when regret changes flavors. After it burns long enough, it stops tasting like shame and starts tasting like wisdom. I think this thing is cooking the leftovers. Morty laughed softly. Cooked regret soup. Rick snorted. Still better than canned hope. Hours blurred. Outside, snow fell heavier, pressing its white hush against the garage windows. Rick finally leaned back on a stool, exhaustion folding across his shoulders. Don't stay awake, he said. She's got the rest handled. She? He nodded toward the swirling machine. I call it her because forgiveness always ends up mothering us. They left it spinning overnight. Sometime before dawn, Morty woke to strange stillness. He tiptoed downstairs again. The candles had nearly finished burning. Instead of smoke, each released small hollows that lingered inches above the wicks. Rick was asleep in his chair, face softened beyond cynicism. The hollows hovered like tiny moons around him. Morty didn't dare blow them out. He crouched near the machine and saw faint projections in the air, images of every apology ever spoken in that garage, between them, inside them. The light rearranged those fragments into patterns, shapes forming and dissolving like sentences written with fog. One of them formed clearly enough for Morty to read. Thank you for identifying the distance between error and kindness. Another shimmered, I am smaller than my regrets now, and that's okay. He sat there until the messages faded, comforted by the idea that mistakes could learn grammar of gratitude once rewritten by light. When Rick stirred awake, sunlight already crept through frosted panes. He blinked, groaned, and cracked his neck. Well, he rasped. What's our diagnostic summary? Morty smiled sleepily. It worked. How can you tell? I feel lighter. Rick eyed the now dormant apparatus. Where candles had stood, 8 smooth glass orbs remained, each containing a permanent swirl of captured glow. You're right, he said after a moment. Garage feels less haunted. He reached for one orb, held it to sunlight. The gleam turned lavender, then gold. Condensed regret looked suspiciously like happiness. Morty stretched. Maybe they're cousins. Rick chuckled. Twins separated at birth, one grows up brooding, the other learns jazz. They both laughed, gentle and small. The humor wasn't escape this time, it was punctuation. That evening they placed the 8 orbs along the windowsill beside the gatherer of light and the flower's reflection. The combined radiance merged into something unbelievably serene, a gradient of silvers and ambers that painted everything in acceptance. Rick poured 2 cups of tea instead of alcohol. Neither commented on the swap. "You realize, kid," he said, "this machine only works because someone younger than me stayed kind long enough to watch it finish." Morty shrugged, embarrassed. "Wes Redemption needs interns." Rick barked a soft laugh. "Best unpaid gig in the cosmos." They clinked mugs. The warmth through ceramic felt almost alive. Outside, snow continued its slow audience of flakes. Each one landed silently as though respecting the private ceremony taking place inside. The two sat watching light move across the glass orbs. Every few minutes one sphere would pulse, releasing a shimmer through the room. A gentle acknowledgement from the architecture of sorrow that had finally learned to rest. Hours passed in beautiful monotony. Conversation dwindled into the comfort of shared breathing. Rick's head eventually nodded forward, landing close enough to Morty's shoulder that the boy didn't move lest he wake him. Around them, the golden glow kept working, translating history into warmth molecule by molecule. When at last Morty's eyes closed, the final candle winked out on its own accord. No smoke this time, no noise, only the soft afterimage of light completing its task. Down in the machine's center, a single symbol etched itself spontaneously into metal. They, divided by love equals forgiveness. The air trembled, satisfied, then stilled. Rick would later find it, trace the mark with one finger, and whisper, "Equation accepted." But for now, there was only peace. 2 generations sleeping beneath the hum of latent tenderness, surrounded by proof that regret, if treated scientifically enough, eventually rewrites itself as grace. Spring came earlier than expected, slipping between the snow's hesitation and the earth's impatience. Crocuses pushed through half-frozen soil. The silver flower by the fence tilted toward them like an older sibling welcoming successors. Sunshine seemed to hum, not brightly but fondly, as if remembering those winter nights of candlelight confession. Inside, the house smelled of thawed dust and something hopeful. Rick moved slower these days, not from fatigue but caution, as if every motion now deserved thought. His inventions sat quiet on shelves, objects resting after realizing their creator finally could. Morty, though, felt restlessness under his ribs. Contentment, he discovered, could turn heavy if you held it too long. There was also the crystal, the first shard that had started everything. It lay in its dish on the windowsill, colorlessly calm yet somehow whispering again. Not voices now, but pulses that his heartbeat answered. Each vibration tugged at him like unfinished homework from the universe. He mentioned it while they shared breakfast. "Grandpa, I think it's calling again." Rick didn't look up from his toast. "Crystals don't make phone calls, kid. I mean it. Something's different. It feels like it wants to finish something." Rick finally met his gaze. There was no sarcasm there, only deliberation. "Finish or start over? I can't tell." "Then ignore it." But Morty couldn't. For nights he found himself sitting by the window, staring at that dull surface until it mirrored his own reflection layered with faint inner light. One evening, as twilight fell like slow ink across the walls, he reached for it. The moment his fingers closed around the shard, a low sound bloomed, barely physical, more resonant than audible. The water in the bowl trembled, the room vibrated gently. From somewhere distant, the flower outside responded, unfolding even though it wasn't dark. Rick barged in only seconds later, eyes sharp but not alarmed, like a parent recognizing a repeat mistake he'd secretly prepared for. He said nothing at first. Morty held the crystal close to his chest, where the hum sank directly into bone. The air thickened. Objects around them stretched slightly, as though gravity had turned polite. Rick exhaled through his nose. "So, this is what curiosity looks like when it forgets its nap." Morty's eyes stayed shut. "I can see everything. Every choice." "What do you mean, everything?" "I mean me." Morty whispered. All the versions. The good one holding hands with the bad one. The one who never met you. They're all asking me to listen at once. Rick stepped closer, voice softer than he remembered owning. Let go of it, Morty. I can't. It's showing I can be everything if I just know enough. Rick's hand hovered near his shoulder. I know that trap, kid. Knowledge that brought collapses under its own applause. You don't need to hold light to see it. But the boy was already elsewhere. Eyes open yet inward, pupils reflecting swirling images like galaxies flipped inside out. Rick realized with a flash of terror that this was precisely what the traveler with no eyes had warned them about. The kind of seeing that ends imagination by perfecting it. The crystal brightened until its light erased edges from everything. Shelves dissolved into outline, shadows forgot their hosts. Still Morty stood unblinking. Rick cursed under his breath, searching for the jar that had once held the traveler's dark fragment. The same one buried behind boxes. His hands trembled through clutter until fingers closed around the towel-wrapped artifact. He tore it free. The dark shard inside glimmered like ink remembering stars. I hope contrast still works, he muttered, stepping toward Morty. The glow was blinding now. Cracks ran through the crystal in his grandson's hands, hairline fractures leaking thin silver smoke. Rick reached out, pressing the dark fragment against it. For an instant, opposites met, light drawn to shadow like breath-seeking lungs. The sound that followed wasn't an explosion. It was a sigh multiplied by eternity, resonating soft enough to rearrange certainty. Both shards shattered. A rain of tiny prisms drifted through the room, landing gently like feathers made of mirror. The blinding ceased. Morty swayed, knees giving way. Rick caught him before he hit the floor. The boy's heartbeat thudded against his palm, fast, alive, confused. The house stood intact, yet the clocks had stopped again, but this time willingly, as though time itself waited for permission to continue. Rick whispered, Morty. Hey, you still with me? Morty blinked back to focus. I'm okay. I think it broke. Rick exhaled, half laugh, half release. Good. About time something did. He eased him onto the couch. When Morty's breathing steadied, they both looked around. Where the crystal had fallen, dust still shimmered in slow eddies. Every tiny particle reflected miniature versions of them, like hundreds of fragments auditioning for meaning. Rick frowned, kneeling to inspect. He picked up one. It melted into his skin, leaving faint luminescence behind. Morty watched. I didn't mean to wreck it. Rick waved a dismissive hand. You didn't wreck it. You freed it from singularity. That thing was always too complete for its own good. The fragments floated higher, gathering above them in lazy orbit. Each flickered autonomously, tiny synapses connecting nothing and everything. See, Rick murmured, almost to himself. No, it's learned diversity. Clarity's not one beam, it's scattered light finding new homes. Morty smiled faintly. I hear them again, but they're quieter. Each one saying thank you. The words resonated faintly through the air, translated into gentle harmonics. Then even the light seemed to breathe out, settling into calm. Rick sank onto the couch beside him, exhaustion wrapped around pride. Well, you did it, kid. You drove yourself to the edge of knowing and came back with a souvenir that doesn't fit in my database. What now? Morty asked. Now. Rick stared at the dust swirling like lazy constellations. Now we live with incomplete information? It's healthier. They sat in comfortable quiet, the kind too large for commentary. The scattered shards circled slower until gravity claimed them one by one, embedding them gently in the floor. When the last fleck dimmed, the universe resumed its habitual ticking, but softer, humbled by interruption. Later that evening, they found the silver flower bowed under the weight of strange dew. Each droplet sparkled with a color not present in any spectrum Rick knew. Morty reached toward it, but Rick stopped him. Don't touch. Let it exhale first. The petals shivered, releasing tiny motes that flew upward to join evening air. The smell they left behind reminded Morty of his dreams, the scent of places that never existed but always felt like home. Rick lit the porch light, not because he needed it, but because ritual mattered. One day, he said quietly, we'll learn when to stop grabbing answers before they grow. Morty looked toward him, eyes reflecting both porch bulb and scattered stars. You ever wish we knew everything, though? Rick chuckled. Knowing. Everything is the universe's way of ending the conversation. I prefer dialogue. They spent the next morning sweeping fragments into small glass vials. None would stay inert, each pulsed faintly, responding to heartbeat proximity. Rick labeled one experiment 0, breakage's birth. Morty kept another in his pocket without label, saying softly, this one's for listening. By afternoon the house had resumed a tempting normalcy, coffee smells, page turns, the low twitter of daytime television. Yet something ineffable lingered beneath. The echo left after perfection surrenders to humility. Morty sat at the kitchen table, rolling the tiny vial between fingers. It doesn't talk anymore, he said. Rick looked up from his paper. Good. If it's quiet. It's finally thinking. I think I understand what it was saying. Morty continued. It kept showing me choices because it wanted to prove possibility is infinite. But infinity's not a map you follow. It's the ocean you float on for a while. Rick folded the newspaper, smiling. Poetic. Stealing my job, Morty grinned. Someone's gotta cover shifts while you retire from arrogance. Rick laughed. Full, deep. A sound that collided gently with memory and improved it. Outside, evening lay over the town again, washing away day's residual certainties. The silver flower seemed taller now, its petals transparent as breath. Through them shone the last light of sunset, a hue somewhere between apology and peace. Morty leaned on the doorway beside his grandfather. So, what was the lesson this time? Rick thought a moment. That clarity is a terrible goal. Blur keeps love interesting. They watched darkness fold across the yard, leaving the faint gleam of embedded shards in the grass, each a quiet souvenir of chaos beautifully resolved. Long after Morty went to bed, Rick stayed awake, notebook open, pen motionless. He wrote 2 sentences before closing it again. The boy broke the light to see the rest of it. And for once, the universe didn't mind. He lifted the small bottle with its single glowing fragment and whispered, "Good night, clarity. Rest in pieces." The vial pulsed faintly, one slow heartbeat, then quiet. Outside, stars rearranged themselves into unrecorded constellations, their scattered geometry mirroring the pattern of little shards asleep in the yard. From above, it looked deliberate. From below, it looked merciful. Either way, certainty was gone, and that absence shimmered like peace. Morning arrived like a held note stretched softly across a sky rinsed clean. The world outside Rick's yard looked the same. Mail still late, clouds still untuddy, but the atmosphere carried something invisible yet undeniable. Maybe it was the fragments of the shattered crystal working their quiet chemistry within matter itself. Streets felt friendlier. Sounds hit your ears already half forgiven. Even gravity seemed to pull with better manners. Morty noticed first during his walk to school. The neighbor's dog, usually a ball of bark and distrust, yawned instead of growled when he passed. Downtown, overworked baristas poured hearts into lattes without irony. No one honked at red lights. People waved strangers through. It was as if the universe had kept a promise it didn't remember making. In the garage, Rick mapped it out the only way he knew, by refusing to entirely believe it. On the chalkboard he drew connected spirals muttering sympathetic resonance, consciousness contagion, mass hallucination of decency. Then, grudgingly, or maybe progress, he caught the reflection of his own grin in a beaker and shook his head. The grin stayed. Fine, he said to no one. Option D, optimism with side effects. When Morty returned that afternoon, he found his grandfather leaning against the open door, watching the horizon like a man trying to measure peace with uncalibrated instruments. Something's changed, the boy said, dropping his backpack. Everyone's nicer. Rick nodded slowly. Reality's adjusting its personality test. Happens when too many minds suffer a shared epiphany. He turned. Think of it as collective good manners. Rare, self-propagating, prone to collapse at first sign of cynicism. That sounds good. Morty said, uncertain. Disorienting good, Rick clarified. The cosmos took your forgiveness experiment personally. Now it's beta testing empathy on a planetary scale. Morty blinked. So we didn't just fix ourselves. We fixed everything? Rick chuckled. Let's not get cosmic ego here. We nudged the mirror. The reflection cleaned itself out of embarrassment. They walked to the backyard. Snow had fully gone, replaced by grass so green it looked slightly shy about its own brightness. The silver flower was still there, proud but humble, its translucent stem thickening like it had inherited responsibility. Around it stretched a strange meadow that hadn't existed before, wildflowers in unfamiliar colors, gentle blues and soft corals that seemed to hum when wind touched them. Morty whistled. This was a lawn yesterday. Rick crouched, brushing fingers along a petal shaped like a drop of smoke. Photosynthesis upgraded to empathy thesis. He murmured. They're absorbing kindness instead of carbon dioxide. He looked up at the sky where clouds rearranged lazily, tracing patterns suspiciously similar to hearts and infinity symbols. Show-off atmosphere. He grumbled, hiding delight. The transformation spread quietly during the next days. On news screens, anchors reported inexplicable spikes in cooperation, governments negotiating without threats, social media algorithms losing interest in outrage. Scientists titled it, The Gentle Anomaly, which Rick found both flattering and unimaginative. Morty watched these stories from the couch, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of candle wax from the regret machine. Do you think it'll last? He asked. Rick, tinkering with a cup of coffee, said, Entropy loves a relapse. But even temporary enlightenment rewrites memory. Once the world knows how good it feels to pause before hurting something, some portion of it stays that way. He joined Morty on the couch, unusually comfortable with silence. Outside, rain began, soft but musical, drumming complex patience against the roof. Each drop carried faint light, shimmering for a second before sinking into soil. Not lightning, something gentler, weather illuminated. Rick watched it trickle down the window pane. See, even precipitation's practicing empathy. Morty smiled sleepily. Worlds learning by example. As days accumulated, even their dreams reflected the new cadence. Morty saw cities built entirely from sighs of relief. Rick dreamed of blueprints that designed themselves just to admire perfection and fade before vanity caught up. They shared these fragments over breakfast without irony. One morning Morty announced, I think I met a version of you in a dream who taught at a school for patience. He had laughter lines. Rick smirked. Then he's a fraud. But maybe a useful one. The biggest shift appeared not in people or plants, but in time itself. After the shattering, hours stopped marching. They ambled. Days didn't end so much as lean into each other. Clocks still worked because they enjoyed being involved, but everyone knew they were ceremonial now. Morty said it felt like living inside one endless exhale. Rick coined a term, chronological softness. Then, to Morty's amusement, added, You realize this is the opposite of insanity. The whole planet's gone sane at low volume. They decided to document these observations for whomever might someday wake up grumpy again. Rick called the journal the Field Notes of a Humbled Scientist, though Morty suspected he titled it that so no one else would believe it existed. They wrote together nightly. He would scribble formulas, Morty would translate them into sentences people could fall asleep to. When they read aloud, the words lined up unintentionally as poem. We taught the wind to listen by forgiving its noise. It taught us how to linger without needing reasons. Rick pretended indifference, but his eyes softened as if the poem had secretly solved something physics never could. Weeks passed in easy rhythm until the sky itself, perhaps emboldened by humanity's new demeanor, decided to join the experiment. One twilight, light lingered unusually long, tinting everything rose and violet at once. Rick adjusted his telescope, muttering, Sunset's running extra minutes. Feels smug about it. Through the instrument, he noticed thin filaments stretching from star to star, threads of the same radiant matter that had once swirled inside the gatherer of light. They're multiplying, he said faintly. The shards integrated into atmosphere, now building cosmic networks. Morty peered through the telescope and gasped. Each filament pulsed like a heartbeat. Constellations blinked in sync, their lines no longer mythic beasts but handprints, as if the universe had taken up drawing itself as community art. Rick set the telescope aside. So the welcome party extends galactic. Collective gentleness achieved critical mass. Soon frontier space will learn terrible concept called empathy and cancel all wars for sleepovers. Morty laughed. I'd go to that sleepover. You already are, Rick said, pointing upward. We all are. But even in paradise fatigue creeps. Humans being built from curiosity can't help prodding peace occasionally. One night Morty confessed, I keep waiting for something bad. Everything's so good it feels fragile. Rick nodded, gaze steady. Fragile's fine. That's how light travels. This isn't a fault. It's physics styling as emotion. He leaned back, sipping amaretto disguised as medicine. If the world breaks again, it'll remember how to heal. That's our upgrade. Morty breathed easier at that. Maybe resilience was the only immortality worth having. One afternoon they returned to the field where they'd planted the first jar of empathy months ago. Now it had become an entire garden. Dozens of luminous flowers swayed in color phases, turquoise melting to soft amber, then lavender. The air above buzzed with small winged creatures that looked halfway between bees and pieces of music. They gathered light instead of pollen, returning it to the petals they loved. Rick stood quiet for once. Morty whispered, It worked. We made things gentler just by caring long enough. Rick kicked at grass to hide emotion. Don't go printing that on a motivational poster. But yes, apparently compassion is pollinatable. They lingered until night slid in, carrying pleasant melancholy. The flowers lit themselves, each bloom a tiny lantern. Rick looked across the glowing field and murmured, Phrasey, how we accidentally terraformed empathy. Morty smiled, and you said softness was chemically boring. Rick laughed quietly. Fine, softness wins. But don't let the galaxy hear I said that. On the walk home, everything felt interconnected. Streetlights pulsed gently as they passed, matching footfalls. Even shadows seemed cooperative, overlapping smoothly without wars of angle. Morty walked with hands in pockets, eyes half closed. I think this is what forgiveness looks like when it grows up, he said. Rick answered, It looks like the whole cosmos finally took a deep breath and did not feel guilty for being happy. They stopped at their gate. Behind them the meadow glowed faintly in the distance ahead. Kitchen lights burned warm. Between those two gentlenesses they stood perfectly centered. Grandpa, Morty asked, Do you think it's done? The journey? Rick looked upward where stars blinked like a patient jury. No story ever ends after learning peace. It just forgets urgency. He smiled. So yeah, maybe we start resting on purpose. That night the world slept unusually well. Animals curled tighter. Rivers lowered their volume. Morty dreamed of billions of alternate worlds watching theirs with envy, beginning to imitate. Planets whispering apologies, comets slowing down to admire beauty, distant galaxies smiling through gravitational waves that looked suspiciously like laughter. And somewhere beyond all that, two tiny figures, grandfather and grandson, stood at a fence glowing silver, quietly proud, quietly tired, quietly human. When dawn came, the light had that new clarity visible only after shared redemption. Wind roamed lazily through the town, brushing cheeks in passing, delivering an unspoken message whose meaning was simple and infinite: be kind again. It works every time. The season folded itself over the Smith house with the calm of someone smoothing blanket edges. The world, newly gentle, no longer demanded miracles. Birds rehearsed slower songs. Coffee cooled without bitterness, and evenings stretched longer just to admire their own color. After months of motion disguised as discovery, the air hinted that lessons could exist without experiments. Rick was the first to admit the universe had entered its nap phase. Finally, he told Morty one morning, the cosmos caught up to my laziness. Yet even idleness in Rick's hands meant choreography. He began building contraptions designed not to work, machines whose only function was stillness. Morty would find him staring proudly at an unplugged generator or polishing tools that refused to spark. "What's that one for?" Morty asked one afternoon, pointing to a small cube humming faintly on the workbench. Rick wiped his hands on a rag. "That," he said, "the world's first intentional non-invention. It does absolutely nothing except prove I can stop." He pressed a button. The cube let out a single sigh-like tone and went silent again. Somehow the sound relaxed the entire garage. "I call it the nap engine," he muttered, satisfied. "Runs on permission." Morty laughed. "You're literally teaching yourself to rest." "I'm in advanced studies," Rick said. "Figure I'll make the syllabus universal by next Thursday." That remark wasn't only jest. The new calm inside him carried an urge to demonstrate that peace could be practical. He began adjusting household rhythms, lights dimming automatically at sunset instead of blinking fluorescent midnight. Experiments paused after 2 hours regardless of progress. Every action obeyed an invisible reminder: there's always tomorrow, and tomorrow deserves something unbroken. Morty tracked these changes quietly, puzzled but pleased. Rick brewed tea instead of pulling energy drinks from the fridge. His laughter arrived from chest rather than throat. He started calling everyday pauses micro-vacations, keeping a chalk list of things to not accomplish. At the top he scribbled one: "Breathe like you mean it." One dusk he called Morty outside. "Got something to show you." The backyard glittered faintly. The garden they had accidentally built glowed like a sleeping constellation. Every flower hummed in its color range: violet in baritone, blue in whisper, silver in near silence. Rick held a small prism in his hand, speckled with tiny fragments from the broken crystal. "Learning tool," he explained. "Turns starlight into patience if you angle it right." He adjusted a knob on the prism's base until light poured through in lazy spirals. Beams unfolded and curved over the yard, forming a dome of dim rainbow mist. Morty felt the temperature drop slightly. Even insects paused mid-flight, quieter than curiosity. Rick's eyes softened. "You feel that? That's the math of rest. Frequencies below ambition." Morty exhaled slowly, watching breath mingle with light. "It feels alive but tired." "Exactly," Rick said, voice near whisper. "Energy without agenda. Hardest state to maintain." They sat on the porch, under that dome of gentle light. Stars peeked through gaps in spectral haze, blinking slower, as if politely yielding the sky to their imitation. Morty leaned back until head rested on the wood. Rick mirrored him. For a long stretch neither spoke. There was nothing left to analyze. Observation had replaced inquiry. After a while Rick said, almost bashful, "You know what equation the universe keeps teaching us?" Morty turned his head. "What?" "Momentum minus fear equals peace. Basic stuff. I just never took the class seriously." Morty smiled. "You're kind of professor material, you know?" Rick groaned. "Don't insult me." A night wind moved through the yard, scattering silver pollen from the flowers into the prism's light. Each grain created a faint streak high above them, like tiny comets curving around invisible warmths. From somewhere far away, a faint chime echoed, not loud, just memory visiting politely. Morty broke the hush. "What made you start building?" "Nap engines and rest machines and stuff." Rick rubbed the back of his neck. "Figured if curiosity's going to stay my bad habit, it better learn better posture. All those years measuring galaxies, proving points, out-arguing silence. Turns out the most rebellious thing I can do now is not improve anything." He laughed softly. "Whole life labeled me genius. Finally I'm smart enough to be dumb and calm." "Feels good though, right?" Morty asked. "Yeah," Rick said. Then after a pause, unnervingly good. "Even my anxiety doesn't know what to do with itself." He pointed toward the prism's glow, which had shifted from rainbow to milky white. "See that? Pure rest spectrum. Not excitement, not boredom, just belonging." Morty nodded slowly, eyelids heavy. "Looks like breathing turned into color." "That's the plan. Breathe enough. Light learns the choreography." They shared a grin made sleepy by satisfaction. Above them, clouds moved with exaggerated grace, dragging the smell of faraway rain. Rick tilted his head, calculating that scent. "Moisture from 2 counties over," he muttered. "Must be taking its time." 2. The next morning Morty woke late to a house already tranquil. Rick sat by the kitchen window sipping tea. The silver flower on the sill bent slightly toward him like a pet waiting to purr. Morning, Morty yawned. Did anything happen? Rick smiled. Exactly nothing. Perfect success story. He turned the prism slowly so sunlight refracted in little halos across walls. Lesson for today? He announced. Rest as rebellion. Every creature needs a union break from eternity. He handed Morty a similar prism, smaller, handheld, humming quietly. Your version. Point it at something and promise not to measure the outcome. Morty aimed it at the living room wall. The beam spread and settled into a moving pattern. It wasn't static like ordinary light, but pulsed in rhythm with his own breathing. Whenever he relaxed, the color deepened. Whenever tension returned, hues faded. Rick watched, nodding. Biofeedback for the soul. Even Cosmos likes to know you're taking it easy. Morty chuckled. So this teaches me to nap properly. Rick smirked. Essential curriculum. Graduation requires drooling. They spent the day experimenting with stillness, as if it were a series of delightful hacks, staring contests with clouds, synchronized yawning. Semesters in sighing. Every act of slowness became celebration. At one point Rick built a device that automatically brewed tea at the exact temperature patience reaches flavor. He called it the temporal kettle of perspective. By evening the entire house carried rhythm of rest. Every lamp glowed softer, every clock ticked like a respectful whisper. Beth came home joking that she'd walked into an aromatherapy commercial. Even Jerry, normally allergic to calm, entered tiptoed and stayed marvelously unannoying for a record 5 minutes. When night returned, Rick and Morty carried blankets to the backyard. The prism dome reignited above them on its own, like the sky remembered rehearsal. Rick adjusted none of it. Surrender was part of the comprehension final. They lay back watching meteors drift like lazy brushstrokes. Morty spoke first, voice a drowsy hum. Feels like everything's breathing together now. People, stars, even us. Rick exhaled through his nose, smile audible. Synchronization's overrated scientifically, but emotionally. Yeah, pretty efficient. Grandpa? Do you ever wish it could have been like this earlier? All the peace without the chaos first. Rick thought a long moment. Nah. Serenity's worth less if you didn't sweat for it. The scar teaches sleep its value. Morty turned the small prism in his hand, watching starlight bend around his fingers. So this is what we do now. Just keep practicing rest. Yup, Rick said. Retire into moment-by-moment existence. Big upgrade from universal existentialism. They laughed quietly, the sound blending into chirping from distant fields. The laughter carried no edge, no punchline. It was truth disguised as humor, the final step in every lesson they'd never planned to learn. Past midnight the wind grew cooler. Rick pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Morty was already asleep, lens still glowing faintly near his chest. Rick looked at the boy, the calm arc of breathing. The complicated creature turned uncomplicated by rest, and whispered, "Lesson passed, kid." He turned his gaze upward. The stars blinked in unison, each pause between twinkles perfectly timed, as if even distant suns had joined the syllabus. For a man who'd once chased answers faster than light, this slow choreography felt like the highest achievement his species could manage. He whispered to the night. Motion achieved understanding, stillness achieved grace, then chuckled softly. Guess I finally graduated. The horizon shivered with pale line of coming dawn. Rick remained seated until warmth touched his face. A bird chirped once, realized the world wasn't in a hurry, and fell silent again, respecting the long pause before morning. The prism's light dimmed, signaling completion of its single assignment. Rick pocketed it, muttering, "Even gadgets deserve naps." He stood, stretched, and glanced one last time at Morty still asleep under constellations slow, dancing overhead. "Good night, partner," he whispered. As he walked inside, the silver flower bowed lightly, misted by dew so delicate it almost didn't exist. Every strand of light in the garden matched the rhythm of Morty's breathing. For a while, the whole planet seemed to nap through him, a quiet engine powered solely by rest. The new summer arrived as if poured from a pitcher of gold. Mornings carried that fragile hesitance before heat grows decisive, evenings stretched farther into lavender. For the first time in memory, the Smith house felt perfectly aligned with itself. Rick's experiments slept under dust covers, Morty's notebooks piled without urgency. Even the clocks had stopped proudly at random hours, decoration instead of dictator. Rick woke one morning and felt an odd hunger, not the kind his stomach could fix. Family synchronization exercise, he announced at breakfast. Basically, I'm hosting dinner but making it inconvenient enough to mean something. Beth narrowed her eyes. Jerry blinked like an alarmed goldfish. Summer looked resigned. But Morty grinned. He knew the tone. His grandfather's version of tenderness translated into logistics. Preparations began at noon, though the meal itself wasn't planned until dusk. The idea, Rick explained, was to stretch one dinner until it outlives time zones. He wanted food that changed as the day changed. A menu of conversions. They started with bread dough rising softly while sunlight thickened behind the windows. Beth chopped without speaking. The rhythm of knife against board formed percussion to Rick's humming. Jerry dusted ingredients needlessly but earnestly. Summer arranged flowers, muttering, "Historic event. World peace achieved in suburban kitchen." Morty watched it all as though inside a dream of normalcy that knew it was extraordinary. The smell of proofing bread folded into the air, echoing the scent of the silver flower outside. They opened the windows, letting the two aromas trade secrets. By afternoon, sunlight washed every surface in patient amber. Rick had moved experiments into the yard, now disguised as barbecue equipment. The table was dragged outside under their favorite tree. The silver flower gently bowed toward it, guardian of calm. When the first course was ready, soup the color of dawn, it arrived slow, steaming in the liminal space between meal and meditation. They sat, no clocks allowed, no phones. Rick declared, "Eat, like this is your only calendar." At first, conversation stuttered from habit. Jerry tried a joke, Beth corrected it with affection. Morty sipped quietly, the world reducing itself to spoon, flavor, breath. Then something eased. Even the air around them seemed to uncurl. A breeze played with napkins but never stole them. They spoke about nothing that required solutions, songs half remembered, vacations that might still happen, the absurdity of sleeping birds. Each topic floated, laughed at, lightly drifted off. Laughter came like color variations, subtle, warm, genuine. Rick leaned back, regarding the sky through half-closed eyes. "This," he said, "is what cause and effect look like when they're happily married." Beth raised her glass, to staying weird enough to notice. The toast lingered longer than champagne bubbles. Morty tucked that moment into memory the way some people save pressed flowers, knowing it will fade but wanting the outline later. Afternoon sneaked into evening. The garden shifted tone from amber to blue. Cicadas began their rhythmic applause. The family lingered around the table, plates mostly empty yet not cleared. Rick fetched another round of tea, brewed from leaves grown near the empathy flowers, aromatic and slightly luminescent. In mugs it looked like moon captured on surface of still water. He set one before Morty. "Call it chrono brew," Rick explained. "Same flavor no matter the hour. Helps linear minds survive eternity." Morty sniffed, grinning. "Smells like patience." "That's because patience finally figured out branding," Rick said. They both laughed softly. The silver flower glowed brighter as dusk matured. Each pulse spread faint gleam across plates, spoons, conversation. The light wasn't intrusive. It seemed to time their words so none overlapped, turning dialogue into music. At some point, even Jerry stopped over-explaining. Under the darkening sky, the second course arrived, grilled vegetables painted by flame, their colors vivid even in low light. It felt almost ceremonial. They ate slower than humans logically should, measuring bites against cricket song. Around 10 p.m. Summer yawned. "Dinner's lasted 8 hours," she said. Rick nodded, pleased. "We're halfway through. Midnight's intermission." When midnight came, Rick produced his final dish, simple sandwiches sizzling unexpectedly with starlight mayonnaise. Nobody asked why. Everyone accepted that flavor of absurd peace tasted slightly celestial. They ate under constellations that took turns winking, patient performers in a sky they all shared. Morty caught himself half dozing between courses, headlight from contentment rather than fatigue. For the first time, he saw his family framed as more than chaos. They were a constellation too, 4 stubborn orbits around Rick's reluctant sun. He whispered this to him. Rick looked embarrassed, mumbled, "Well, planets choose their own gravity, but his eyes gleamed. Between yawns, Beth said, "Dad, when did you start doing family dinners?" Rick poured himself another mug before answering. "When progress got boring," he said simply. "Turns out love's more efficient fuel. Burns slower." Morty felt warmth spread beyond skin. It belonged deeper, maybe shared with the universe itself. Dawn found them still at the table. The sky had traded darkness for chalk violet morning. Steam rose from leftover cups, mingling with a light mist that had settled during night's gentlest hours. The silver flower quivered slightly as dew gathered on its petals. Birds resumed their soft rehearsal for daytime chatter. The world never noticed the pause. It resumed effortlessly from where laughter had left off. Rick stretched and stood. Dinner successful. One complete rotation of Earth, 0 arguments. World record. Beth laughed. "Is that what you're going to record in your journal?" He smirked. "Already did." Called it when entropy took a meal break. They began clearing plates, though none of them felt done. It wasn't hunger, it was enjoyment reluctant to vacate. Morty stacked glasses carefully, catching slivers of light in each. Their clinking formed accidental rhythm, even work sounded restful. When a plate slipped from his hands, he tried to grab it, but instead of breaking, it landed on soft earth with discreet grace intact. Rick chuckled. Even gravity's in on the truce. The Banoon. The same day, technically the same dinner, they relocated inside for dessert disguised as breakfast. Sliced fruit glistened, slices of time itself, sweet enough to forgive repetition. Jerry remembered an old tune from college and hummed off key, summer filled in correct notes. Beth leaned against the doorway watching, a mix of surprise and affection softening her features. Rick, apron stained with evidence of productivity's defeat, poured final servings of Krona brew. Its perfume filled the kitchen, richer now vanilla with echoes of lullaby. Morty asked quietly, "Grandpa, what's the point of a dinner that lasts a day?" Rick pretended to think, then said, "To prove you can repeat peace without getting bored." He set down his cup and looked to his family one by one. "See, scientifically, rest rebuilds neurons. Emotionally, it repairs trust. Socially, it freaks out people who profit from hurry. So I'm calling this an act of rebellion." Jerry raised a slice of bread like a toast. "To rebellion with napkins?" Everyone laughed. Morty nearly spilled his tea. Outside, sunlight overflowed onto tabletops, making shadows of their hands blur into one large shape. No one moved to differentiate them. As afternoon matured, the family dispersed gently. Beth took leftover bread to a neighbor. Jerry wandered off to write something nobody would read, but he'd enjoy writing anyway. Summer fell asleep in a hammock. Rick sat under the tree cleaning crumbs from his inventions, while Morty lounged beside him reading half a book. The wind flipped the pages it liked. Streamer ribbons of empathy pollen drifted across the yard, measuring how far contentment could travel. Not far. Just far enough. When Morty closed the book, Rick glanced over. "So, philosopher," he said, "final analysis." Morty thought, "Maybe time is just a meal we decide to savor together." Rick nodded approvingly. "Add that to my syllabus." Advanced course in idleness. They sat until sunset repeated itself, orange leaning back into purple. The air cooling felt like punctuation more than ending. Finally Morty whispered, "Should we do this again tomorrow?" Rick smirked, eyes closing. "Tomorrow is a long nap away. Let's sleep on it." The flower in the garden pulsed once, as if laughing quietly with them, and released one final breath of silver light. It drifted above the table where crumbs still glittered, circling once before fading into sky's dimming blue. Inside the house, clocks resumed their rhythms, all at slightly different seconds. None of them were wrong anymore, each marked life from its own perspective, collectively forming harmony of imperfection. The dinner that had lasted a day continued in their breathing patterns, their footsteps, the soft memory of words unsaid, because they were unneeded. As night reclaimed the world, Rick murmured from his chair, "I finally invented something that keeps." Then he closed his eyes, the lazy architect of a fulfilled silence. Above the backyard, stars arranged themselves loosely into the shape of a table. If anyone looked carefully, they would swear 5 seats glittered there, the 5th reserved for tomorrow whenever it decided to arrive. There comes a point in any good story when the world itself begins to whisper, "You can stop running now." The dinner that stretched across a day had left behind something more permanent than the full bellies and soft laughter at tempo. From then on, every step Morty took seemed cushioned by extra seconds, as though time was letting him borrow pauses that didn't belong to anyone else. Rick called it residual stillness. Beth simply called it peace. But Morty, he named it the in-between. He started noticing it first in the hum of the refrigerator, tiny beats of silence between its mechanical sighs, in the 3-second gap between raindrops sliding down the same pane of glass, in the way people blinked out of rhythm with each other yet somehow carried the same conversation. Each gap felt like a doorway only awareness could walk through. One evening he told Rick, "I think we're surrounded by small pieces of forever that everyone steps over." Rick looked up from the book he wasn't pretending to read. "Congratulations, you've discovered patience." "No, really," Morty insisted. "When things go quiet, it's not empty. It's like the world's waiting." Rick closed the book, smirk hovering. "I'm listening." So Morty described what he now called his journeys between moments. How he would walk to the bus stop before dawn, when streets were cleansed of conversation, and if he moved slowly enough, the air changed thickness. Streetlights glowed more sincerely. Patterns in concrete rearranged themselves into small maps of possibility. Sometimes he swore he could see faint filaments lacing everything together, the same threads that once sang inside the gatherer of light. They trembled politely whenever he acknowledged them. Rick said nothing at first. The older man rested chin on hand, watching his grandson's eyes shine with the dangerous beauty of discovery. Finally he said, "You're describing observational quantum grace." Simpler translation, "You're noticing existing." Morty grinned. "So you've done it too?" "Only accidentally," Rick admitted. "Usually while hungover." The awareness didn't stay confined to Morty. In their quiet house, everyone began to exhibit small ceremonial delays. Beth breathing deep before answering a page from work, Summer pausing before speaking irritation, even Jerry mastering the heroic art of thinking twice. Rick found these changes amusing. He'd never told a single one of them to slow down, yet there they were, disciples of deceleration. He continued teaching without teaching. When Morty asked, "How do I hold onto the in-between without breaking it?" Rick told him, "You don't. You let it hold onto you." Then he handed the boy a small handheld device, shaped like pocket watch but without hands. On its glass face swirled mist instead of numbers. "It measures attention," Rick explained. "When the swirl settles, you're present. When it spins, you're somewhere stupid." Morty took it everywhere. Soon the swirl spent most days motionless. One night, after everyone else had drifted to sleep, Morty decided to test the power of simply not hurrying. He stepped out into the empty street where houses slept like closed books. A gentle snow had begun again, the first of late winter's goodbyes. Flakes drifted downward slowly enough to reward noticing. He raised a palm, caught one, watched it melt, then looked up at thousands still falling. There was a fraction of a heartbeat where they seemed suspended. A constellation of water deciding against decision. Morty stepped forward and found that space between falling and landing. Gravity forgot its job. He was walking inside a paused second. The world frozen around him wasn't immobile. It breathed in wavelengths, thin quivers of luminous air. Every snowflake shivered like musical notation awaiting performance. Transmission wires hummed faintly with their own unshared secrets. He felt tiny but entirely necessary, like punctuation in someone else's poem. Without panic he whispered, "Hey!" The air answered with a soft shimmer. One snowflake detached from its stasis, landing between his eyebrows a moment before should have existed. When it melted, his first thought wasn't memory or fear, only gratitude. Later, when movement returned and his lungs remembered ordinary tempo, Morty hurried home, not out of rush but reverence. He woke Rick with total lack of guilt. "Grandpa, you won't believe this." Rick rolled over. "You're right. What a relief." "I think I walked inside a second." Rick sat up, bed hair turned his disbelief into halo. You mean you hallucinated a metaphor? No, it was real. Time paused but kept breathing. Rick studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Guess you're ready for graduate-level patience. He gestured toward his cluttered desk. There's a jar there labeled Silent Sample. Open it. Morty obeyed. Inside the jar was nothing, or the perfect version of nothing. When he unscrewed the lid, the room brightened very slightly, like an exhale rejoining lungs. It feels familiar, he said. Rick nodded. That's a slice of stillness I bottled once between radio frequencies. Every time you release it, it replicates itself. Guess you triggered the same field but bigger. Good work, kid. Time's biggest secret finally trusts a teenager. From then on, awareness spread like fragrance. Even strangers on sidewalks seemed tuned to softer volume. Some smiled without visible reason, as if overhearing mercy. Rick documented these days not with graphs, but with Heike's pinned to the refrigerator. Between two heartbeats, the galaxy inhalers once more. Half asleep, still kind. Morty, rereading them, laughed at the idea of his grandfather as accidental poet. Rick denied any artistic ambition. Writing's just me testing if calm survives punctuation. A weeks passed and spring began to consider returning. One afternoon, they took the prism and the silence watch on a walk to the nearby frozen lake, now only half ice, half mirror. They sat on the dock watching a line of geese rearrange leadership mid-flight. Rick said, "That right there is cosmic administration. Rotating responsibility so nobody snaps." After a while Morty whispered, "Before all this, all the journeys, all the light, you ever regret how fast you made me grow up?" Rick looked at the water for a long time. I can regret and not undo. That's the contract of existence. But speed gave you depth you wouldn't get from shallow ease. He smiled. Now look at you, teaching me how to walk through seconds like they're gardens. Morty fiddled with the watch until the swirl stillness steadied again. I think the journey isn't from point A to B anymore. It's just hovering between things until love shows up. Rick laughed softly. Nicely put. The universe approves your translation. They stayed till sunset. When the sun slipped under the horizon, its reflection refused to vanish immediately. The lake held color. Burned orange stretched into eternity's aftertaste. Neither wanted to blink that away, so both kept eyes open until moisture blurred reality into impressionism. It taught them something again, that letting go could look exactly like focusing. That night Morty wrote down what he'd learned, though he didn't intend to publish it. His notes looked like diary entries whispered by dream. Every moment contains a corridor. Step in quietly. If you hurry, it locks. Rick found the paper later and smiled privately. He folded it into his journal between formulas on empathy physics. At the top he wrote, Lesson 17, Time's not a line but a lullaby. Toward the end of that hard-to-measure month, Morty awoke to snow again, the final, forgiving snowfall before spring. He dressed quietly and stepped into night air alive with hush. The world glowed bluish, as if moonlight had taken pity on darkness and learned compromise. He walked slowly to the yard where the silver flower still stood. Around it, tiny green shoots pushed through frost. Each time they trembled, the air rang a little. Faint chimes from patience itself. Morty closed his eyes, stepped forward, and without realizing, entered another small slip between seconds. He didn't walk this time. He floated on breath of awareness. Through that soft fold of reality, he could see his family sleeping safely. Universes turning like contented cats in sunlight, and Rick sitting upstairs pretending to be awake, just to keep watch. He felt no must-do, no should-be, only is. The moment lasted somewhere between heartbeats and decades. Then time, ever the courteous host, resumed. Morty found himself standing again beside the flower. Snow melted around its roots. He smiled up at the moon and whispered, "Thanks for waiting." Behind the window curtain, Rick heard the faint words. He closed his eyes, half-smile returning. "Anytime, kid. That's what the in-between's for." He leaned back and let sleep catch him between ticks of his own pulse, exactly where he belonged, in the quiet corridor of a night that had finally forgiven haste. The sound of spring arriving was almost imperceptible, a subtle rearranging of whispers beneath soil and sky. Dew loosened the stiffness of Earth's sentences. Trees experimented with green again. The air itself smelled like faith in small beginnings. Rick and Morty felt it long before they saw it. Light filtering through the window carried a gentle confidence, less like exposure and more like reassurance. The gatherer of light, or what remained of it, those scattered shards, had lost its glow by then. They no longer pulsed or hummed when someone entered the room. They simply existed as faintly luminous dust coating workbench corners, like dreams that had earned retirement. Morty found Rick sitting before the dormant collection one morning, eyes unfocused, hands clasped in his lap. For once there were no tools, only a mug of tea cooling slowly. "She's tired," Rick said without turning around. "Used herself up making the world tolerable." Morty leaned against the doorway. "Can something like that even sleep?" Rick shrugged. "If you've taught the entire cosmos to calm down, you've earned a nap that lasts forever." He sipped, grimaced, and added, "Tea's cold." Perfect metaphor. Morty smiled softly. Maybe it wants to go back where it started. Rick looked at him, eyes no longer sharp with analysis, only wary affection. "Already thought of that," he admitted. "I just wanted to see if I could stand goodbye this time." He opened a small wooden box. Inside lay the last substantial fragment of the original crystal, faint as old moonlight caught in glass. It flickered once as if to confirm it had heard them. "Will we take it?" Morty asked. "The meadow," Rick said. "The one beyond our neighborhood, where the tall grass never stops sounding like waves. It reminds me that nothing really sits still while sleeping." They set out near dusk. The walk was slow by design. Neither spoke much, their footsteps filled the conversation. Houses receded behind them, windows blinking good-natured farewells. The horizon stretched wider with every breath, until the road gave way to soil, and the silver flowers' distant descendants glimmered faintly along the field's edge. Morty carried the box. Rick held a small spade and absolutely no sarcasm. When they reached the meadow, twilight already draped itself in mist. The grass glowed slightly, each blade moving like it remembered rhythm. Fireflies sparked among them, tiny custodians of continuity. They found the center, a shallow hollow where old roots twisted into a natural cradle. It looked carved by time specifically for this purpose. Rick knelt, sighing not from effort but emotion. "Full circle, kid. The universe does love a good loop." Morty handed him the box. "Should I say something?" Rick shook his head but smiled. Words always arrive late to moments. "Just listen louder." So they did. Wind moved through the field, pulling tiny melodies from each blade of grass. Between those notes flowed the heartbeat of the earth itself. The soft boom every living thing feels, but rarely names. The sky deepened into a shade of indigo, so gentle it made shadows look brave. Rick dug a small hole and placed the fragment inside. It rested there without ceremony, grateful to touch something real. Before covering it, Morty leaned close and whispered, "Thanks for teaching me how to slow down." The crystal flashed once, not brightly, but with intention, then faded like a smile turning into sleep. Rick pressed the soil back gently. When he was done, they sat side by side on the ridge watching light settle over the field. "You know," Rick said, "every tool I've ever built was just me arguing with time." That one finally argued back nicely. Morty studied his face. "You miss it already, don't you?" Rick snorted. "I don't miss things, I recontextualize them. But yeah, maybe." He chuckled quietly. "Think of it as depositing interest in the bank of patience." They stayed until the moon arrived, large and low, painting the meadow silver. The spot where the crystal rested began to emit a soft aura, less a light than a temperature. The wind balanced against their faces, warm and cool at once, Morty let his eyes close naturally. That's when he heard it. A faint voice, genderless but familiar. Sleep is the language that translates infinity into kindness. You've earned some now. Rick looked up at the same moment, though he pretended not to hear the words. I swear this planet's getting too sentimental, he said gruffly, wiping one eye as if dislodging dust. After a while, Morty whispered, What'll it become? Rick shrugged. Energy, memory, maybe contentment for moles. Everything recycles, Morty. Even epiphanies. He pulled 2 flasks from his coat, one containing tea from earlier, the other unknown. They mixed and shared in silence, the taste oddly like continuation. As the night grew deeper, mist thickened around the meadow. Their breath turned visible, curling away like script erasing itself before finishing a sentence. Somewhere a distant owl called once, then fell silent, respecting the scene. Rick leaned back on his hands, long white hair catching moon edges. You notice? He said. This isn't sad. Usually letting go tastes bitter. This time it's like finally exhaling after years of taking notes. Morty nodded. I think the crystal whatever, is happy too. Feels warm. That's how you know goodbyes worked, Rick said. They stopped needing language. They dozed there, not wanting to return home yet. Dreams came softly. A meadow of stars lying beneath them, instead of above. 1,000 crystalline figures stretching and yawning the way galaxies might after long nights of burning. In those dreams, Morty saw light curl around Rick's shoulders, like forgiveness taking human form. When he woke, he couldn't tell how much was vision and how much truth. Rick was already awake, sketching something in a notebook. What are you drawing? Blueprint for doing nothing gracefully. He angled the page toward Morty. A spiral labeled with words find, hold, release, repeat. That's all science comes down to, kid. We make the same mistakes with better sincerity each time. A closer to dawn. A thin rain began. Not cold, refreshing. Each drop that touched the buried crystal sent tiny ripples of luminescence through the puddle at their feet. Water replacing light. Cycle resumed. Morty watched the ripples bounce against his boots. Kind of feels like we're burying ourselves a little too, doesn't it? Rick nodded slowly. Pieces, sure. But it's the heavy pieces. The ones that don't float well. He looked toward the east where light began to tip over the hills. After this, we'll only carry what talks in whispers. They stood. The rain quit with cinematic restraint. For one brief moment, the sun's first beam touched the burial spot. From beneath the soil rose 4 tiny sprouts. Not silver but emerald, tiny and honest. Each held within its tips a sliver of light almost too tired to shine. Morty smiled. What do you call those? Rick picked one carefully. Tired morning glories. Give it a month. The meadow will wear more patience than color. He handed the sprout to Morty. Lessened. Growth is how goodbyes stay in touch. They walked home through gleaming streets. Boots muddy, souls clean. Neighbors waved for no reason. The world didn't feel different yet certainly was. Morty glanced at Rick, half expecting the old bravado to return, but his grandpa looked peaceful instead, like he'd finally outsourced chaos to someone else. Back home, Rick placed the empty box on his shelf, scribbled on it with marker project complete proof of rest. Then he stepped outside again, hands in pockets, watching clouds chase light along rooftops. Morty joined him. So what now? The boy asked. Without the crystal? Rick answered without looking away from sky. We become the slow version of ourselves it taught us to be. Small, attentive, occasionally ridiculous. Maybe that's what evolution really is. He sniffed. Also pancakes. Can't save the world on an empty stomach. Together they laughed the kind of laugh that turns sound into sunlight. It lingered over the yard, mixing with the morning wind that carried both goodbye and beginning in the same breath. Much later, afternoon by the new slow standards, Rick found himself sitting on the porch alone, eyes closed. He felt something beneath his feet, a faint resonance from the buried meadow, as if the planet itself was snoring contentedly. He smiled and whispered, "Good nap, old friend." The air shifted, sending a final pulse of light across the sky, not a beam but an exhalation. For a heartbeat, the sun wore the color of the crystal that started it all. Then it normalized, as if pretending no miracle had occurred. Inside, Morty slept on the couch with a book over his chest. The page was half-turned. A sentence peeked out. "All things that shine deserve their dark." Rick read it, nodded quietly, and pulled a blanket over the boy. Evening came with a coolness that smelled of rain and closure. The two sat again by open window watching fireflies, silent because silence finally trusted them. And somewhere beyond sound, deep under meadow, the crystal dreamed. Light folded into earth, folded into time, at peace with being unfinished. Knowing its lesson was now safely alive in the people who had learned how to let it sleep. Years do not pass so much as blur when life decides its content. Seasons carried the Smith house in wide, steady circles. The same tree blooming, the same garden breathing, the same old pair sitting under it keeping universe and boredom in equal balance. The restless thunder that used to follow Rick wherever he walked had diminished into a hum more like laughter spoken in another language. Morty had grown taller, slower in speech, careful with wonder like a craftsman trained by time itself. The crystal never resurfaced. Beneath the meadow, its echoes translated into roots that glowed faintly for anyone kind enough to kneel in tall grass after rain. Children from the town sometimes did without knowing why, coming home with knees wet and inexplicable optimism. The field had become a local myth, the sleep meadow, rumored to calm anyone who lingered too long. Rick never corrected those stories. He figured whoever invented peace deserved partial credit. The house aged beautifully. Walls, once laboratories of accidents, now carried paintings summer made in college soft galaxies, cups of tea orbiting moons. Beth filled the rooms with plants that thrived on patience. Jerry, against probability and earlier evidence, wrote a concise book titled When in Doubt, Breathe Slowly, which sold 5 copies and one thank you letter that made him cry. Rick refused to let the television become relic. Fridays remained their gathering ritual. They'd sit, mugs steaming, channel muted, light shifting over faces that had learned to trust quiet. Not bad, Rick would murmur sometimes, meaning everything at once. Morty's own room looked much the same except for shelves lined with glass jars. Inside each floated a single thread of bioluminescent filament, a remnant seed from the empathy plants. They pulsed faint choral each night like heartbeat echoes from forgiven years. When he traveled, college, later beyond even planets, he carried one jar as reminder that discovery was only respectable when it ended gentler than it began. He never stopped visiting. Every few months he'd step out from some improbable vehicle, greet Rick with obligatory exasperation. But the arguments now were comfortable, even disagreement sounded melodic. One autumn he arrived under low gray skies, the porch smelling of repair and apples. Rick sat rocking slightly in an old chair, notebook open. Morty dropped his bag and sat without invitation. Neither spoke for nearly 10 minutes, a new record for family affection. Finally Rick said, "So Dr. Soft Hands, still confusing compassion with career advancement?" Morty laughed. "Sort of. We're developing quiet habitats on barren moons, dumbs that sing instead of ventilate. People sleep better. Architect of naps," Rick said approvingly. "Proud of you. You taught me." Rick looked up at the creeping clouds. Teaching is just forgetting loudly in front of someone patient. Morty grinned. "That's actually good. Want me to quote you?" "Better not. Wouldn't want a reputation for tenderness." They sat watching the silver flower's descendants sway in the cooled wind. Each bloom threw soft reflections across the porch. Somewhere a clock inside struck wrong hour, but no one corrected it. That evening Rick grew quieter, that specific quiet Morty recognized as memory arriving. He turned the old prism over in his hands. It still bent starlight, though faintly. Its edges had worn smooth, like logic turned into faith. "Kid," he said finally, "I've been thinking about closure." Morty raised an eyebrow. "You hate that word." "Yeah." Rick half smiled. "Because most folks use it to mean escape with paperwork. But maybe closure just means carrying something correctly instead of dragging it." He tapped the porch rail. "After the crystal, after the math, after all that experimenting on emotions, we reached the boring truth: peace pays in silence. And maybe boredom's divine in disguise." Morty chuckled. "You're rewiring philosophy now." Rick shrugged. "When you stop running, you start summarizing." The next morning dawn rose pale and affectionate. Birds negotiated softly above the half-mist of the meadow. Rick brewed tea before anyone woke, then slipped outside. Morty noticed and followed. They walked among the empathy flowers which now stretched nearly to the horizon, light leaping lazily from petal to petal. At the meadow's center they found the place where the original crystal slept. The soil there rose slightly, a mound shaped like a slow heartbeat. Flocks of starlings looped above, performing their elegant calculus of coherence. Rick stopped. "This is where I ask forgiveness again, right?" "For what?" Morty asked. "For assuming science could hold what gratitude carries better." He knelt, pressing his palm to the ground. "Thanks for not exploding, old friend," he murmured. Morty placed his own hand beside his grandfather's. The soil beneath them vibrated faintly, then settled. Acknowledgement, not spectacle. They stayed until the wind changed direction, bringing with it the scent of spring, though snow still clung to distant roofs. Morty looked at the horizon. "What do we do now?" Rick smiled, a small, unheroic, wonderful expression. "We keep being good ancestors." That's always the sequel. The years passed, but that day stayed anchored somewhere outside linear time. Morty eventually taught at the quiet university Rick founded reluctantly under pressure. The campus was merely 3 cabins in the new town that bordered the meadow. Classes had no grades, only naps and notebooks. Its motto, chosen by Rick, patience before proof. Visitors came from scattered worlds to learn about the phenomenon locals called the sleep wave. Most didn't find miracles, only rest. But that turned out to be miracle enough. Tourists arrived hurried, left slower, leaving trails of politeness in their wake. Economy of decency, Rick would have laughed himself proud. He aged well, not immune to time but forgiven by it. When his hands shook too much for equations, he switched to stories. He'd sit on the porch during warm evenings, telling wide-eyed children about the night stars, learn to breathe slower, about the flower born from apology, about the man who accidentally invented calm. They never knew those stories were memories. He liked it that way. Morty would often listen from the steps, smiling. Once, when Rick finished a tale and leaned back gazing into the blended glow of sunset and starlight, Morty asked quietly, "Grandpa, do you ever miss the old days? The wild stuff?" Rick considered, then shook his head. "They had their punchlines, but I prefer reruns where everyone survives." Morty laughed, but something in that answer lodged warmly in him. Not long after, Rick stopped building altogether. He gave his tools away to a new generation of would-be scientists who grew tomatoes with equations of empathy etched into the soil sensors. One evening he asked Morty to walk with him again to the ridge where sky met field. The night was pure silver, the world halfway between heartbeat and hush. They reached the center once more. Rick lowered himself onto the grass with small effort, but no complaint. "The thing about letting light sleep," he said, "is eventually it teaches you how." His eyes caught the stars glimmering where petals released nightly glow. He exhaled slow and even, almost amused. "Look at that, kid. The universe finally matched our breathing." Morty felt an impossible calm content to be both grief and gratitude. When Rick's eyes slid closed, it was the exact gesture of their first lesson, soft seeing, never forceful. Morning found Morty still sitting beside him, hand resting where pulse met silence. The sun rose carefully, as if afraid to disturb completion. Around them, every empathy flower had opened wide, faces toward east like 1,000 small suns acknowledging one larger one. No sadness, only exchange. The meadow absorbed its creator gracefully. Light spread, hovered, and recondensed into air like mist leaving lake. Morty whispered, "Thanks for everything." And the wind, that patient archivist, carried the words outward until even horizon shimmered in reply. He walked home slowly, body heavy but mind precise. Inside, clocks all ticked once in perfect unison before continuing their friendly disagreements. He laughed through tears. They'd learned coordination just long enough to honor the man who'd taught them rhythm. Years later still, travelers passing the meadow would tell stories of an old scientist and a boy whose kindness changed the stability of weather. Sometimes at dusk they swore they could hear conversation carried in rustling grass. "Slow down, you'll miss the miracle." "No, Grandpa, I am the miracle." No one recorded it, because recorders couldn't stay awake through that much peace. And somewhere beyond measurable light, the two continued. Eternally mid-sentence, Rick floating sideways through galaxies cushioned by quiet laughter, Morty tracing the spaces between stars, just to make sure no silence felt lonely. Their story had ended the only way it could, by continuing imperceptibly. Above the sleeping Earth, a final echo rolled through the night, tender and amused. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."